Hello everyone, welcome to Frightening Tales. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from, and if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, now let's get comfortable, relax and dive into tonight's case. Story 1. The Typewriter's Confession. The estate sale smelled of mothballs and regret when antique dealer Jacob Whitlock first saw the 1937 Underwood typewriter. Its keys were yellowed with age, but the ribbon was fresh, too fresh for an object that hadn't been used in decades. First click. Jacob tested the typewriter in his shop that night. The E-key stuck. As he walked away to get oil, 3 sharp clicks echoed through the empty store. When he returned, the paper read, Emma Grace Wilcox, missing since October 17, 1983, check the well. The police report confirmed it. Emma Wilcox had vanished after school in '83. They'd searched the old Henderson well but found nothing. Until Jacob showed them where to dig. The list grows. Over the next week, the typewriter produced. Daniel Ruiz, 1991, bones found where it specified beneath an oak tree. Cyril Yang, 1978, class ring discovered in a drainage pipe. Thomas O'Connell, 1989, remains located behind a false wall in his childhood home. Each victim had disappeared within 20 miles of Jacob's shop. Each name appeared in perfect chronological order. Each typed with distinct pressure patterns as if different hands had used the machine. The breakthrough. Jacob found a connection in newspaper archives. All the missing persons had last been seen near the Red Quill bookshop, owned by Luther Graves from 1965 to 2003. Graves had been questioned but never charged. His typewriter printed alibis were always ironclad. The shop's inventory included one 1937 Underwood typewriter, sold in 2004 estate sale. 37 first edition crime novels, each about missing persons. A ledger with coded entries matching the victims' disappearance dates. The final message. At 3:17 a.m., the typewriter sprang to life while Jacob watched. Luther Graves, 2003, look under the keys. Beneath the typewriter's mechanism, Jacob found a child's tooth wedged near the M key. Fingerprint smudges in dried ink, matched to multiple victims. A tiny scroll reading, they live in the words now. The shop's secret. The abandoned Red Quill bookshop's basement revealed. A wall of handwritten stories describing each disappearance. A collection of personal items arranged like museum exhibits. Luther's final journal entry. The typewriter remembers everything. When you press a key, it keeps part of you forever. I've made them immortal. Now who will tell my story? Epilogue. The typewriter sit in evidence lockup. But guards report clicking noises at night. Fresh names appearing on blank paper. Ink fingerprints that match no living person. Jacob keeps one souvenir, a single keycap Luther had hidden in his journal. The M key. For missing. Story 2. The Shark Arm Case, 1935. Deep waters. By an extraordinary twist of fate, a human arm expelled by a shark became the first link in a bizarre chain of events involving smuggling, blackmail, and murder. It was a balmy spring afternoon on April 17, 1935. Bert Hobson and his son Ron were fishing from a 12-foot, 3.6 meter, launch off Marlborough Point in Coogee, Sydney, Australia. Dissatisfied with their catch so far, they put out set lines baited with horse mackerel before returning home for the evening. The following morning, they returned to see if their set lines had caught anything profitable. They were surprised to discover a tiger shark measuring a mighty 14 feet 6 inches, 4.42 meters. The shark had been lured to the set line to feast on a smaller shark that had become tangled in it. the Hobsons managed to capture the tiger shark, and then sold it to the Coogee Aquarium, which happened to be run by Bert's brother Charlie. The worldwide economic depression of the 1930s had hit Sydney hard, and Charlie Hobson hoped that this exciting addition would attract visitors willing to pay a bit extra to see the impressive shark fed twice a day. The tattooed arm. On the afternoon of April 25th, Anzac Day, a holiday honoring veterans. 8 days after the shark had been caught, a grisly discovery surfaced in the shark's tank. Fortunately, only a few people were present when the aquarium's prize attraction started to thrash about, almost as if it was about to jump out of the pool. Moments later, a human arm clearly expelled by the shark was spotted bobbing in the water, while Bert Hobson used a stick to keep this gruesome find close to the side of the tank, in case the huge shark tried to swallow it again. The police were immediately informed and rushed to the scene. To their surprise, the arm appeared to be in a fair state of preservation. Generally, the gastric juices of a shark would digest human flesh within days. However, the juices of a shark would digest human flesh within days. However, the stress and shock of being captured and put on display may have slowed the shark's digestive processes. A piece of rope was tied around the wrist, and, on the inside forearm, was a tattoo of two sparring boxers. A missing brother. Gradually, theories as to whose arm it was started to build. Some wondered whether the arm had been discarded by a doctor or medical student, while others suggested, rather fancifully, that the arm could have belonged to a man who had committed suicide by plunging into the ocean with his arms tied. Due to decomposition, fingerprinting was no easy task. Medical examiners had to carefully remove skin from the fingers and then slip it over their own glove digits to lift a print. April 29, 1935 Edwin Smith contacts police to report that the arm belongs to his missing brother James. Police received their first lead when a man named Edwin Smith recognized the description of the tattoo. Edwin's brother James had been missing since April 7, after telling his wife that he was going on a fishing trip with a companion. James was a 45-year-old, English-born criminal, police informant, an ex-boxer who lived in the Sydney suburb of Gladesville. Fingerprinting confirmed that the arm did indeed belong to him. It was initially assumed that its discovery was simply evidence of another tragic shark attack, of which there had been 3 in recent months. However, further examination revealed a far more disturbing scenario. It was clear that the arm had not been bitten off by the shark. After all, it had been severed with a knife. The focus of the investigation suddenly shifted to murder. Thanks to Edwin Smith's information, the police at least knew who the arm belonged to. However, they were now faced with arguably the most bizarre case they had ever encountered. In a Wagga Wagga Express article, dated June 15, 1935, detectives freely admitted that they were facing a problem seemingly devised by one of the cleverest killers in the history of Sydney's crime. Shady deals. James Smith had numerous connections with the criminal underworld. And, while looking into his seedy acquaintances, investigators came across the name Reginald Holmes. To many who knew him, Holmes appeared to be a respectable, wealthy businessman and family man who ran a successful boat-building business on the shores of Lavender Bay. However, there was another, hidden side to Holmes' life. Behind the facade of normality, he was involved in various illegal activities, controlling lucrative smuggling and insurance fraud operations from his company, which was strategically situated on the shorefront. Inquiries revealed that Holmes had once hired Smith to collect cocaine, opium, and other contraband dropped overboard by ships coming in from the east. Moreover, investigators discovered that the year before his disappearance, Smith had been using an overinsured yacht owned by Holmes when it mysteriously caught fire and sank. The duo had intended to cash in on the insurance money, but the company concerned became suspicious and refused to pay. Investigators speculated that Smith was shot dead on the shore and his body then dumped in the ocean. They hoped that finding the spent cartridge from the bullet that killed him, as well as identifying the gun that fired it, might lead them to his killer. The beaches from Cronulla to Coogee were painstakingly searched. The shark in the aquarium was also killed, gutted, and examined. However, both of these attempts to find any clues as to how Smith met his end were in vain. Harbor Chase. Initially, Holmes strongly denied any involvement in the bizarre case. But shortly after police questioned him, they received reports of a raving man careening around the harbor in a speedboat with blood streaming down his face. After a lengthy police pursuit, the dazed man was captured and identified as Reginald Holmes. He had a wound on his head, and he claimed that somebody had shot at him. However, the police were skeptical of this story and concluded that Holmes had inflicted the gunshot wound on himself. Either Holmes was trying to cast himself as a victim in the case, or the graze on his head was a failed suicide attempt. Interrogation of Holmes then led investigators to a convicted forger. Interrogation of Holmes then led investigators to a convicted forger named Patrick Brady. Investigators discovered that Smith was last seen drinking and playing cards with Brady at the Hotel Cecil in Cronulla. They also found out that Brady had rented a small cottage called Courtjoy on Talumbi Street in Cronulla. When the cottage was searched, a can of kerosene mixed with blood was found in the pantry. The owner of the cottage noticed that since Brady had rented it, 2 rugs, 2 large mats, a mattress, a metal trunk, and a rope all appeared to be missing. Even more peculiar, the contents of the missing metal trunk had been placed inside a new, larger one that was found in its place. The owner also noted that the cottage had been scrupulously cleaned. Impressed by this accumulation of clues, the police questioned Patrick Brady, and a few days later, they charged him with the murder of James Smith. June 12, 1935 / Reginald Holmes, the key witness in Patrick Brady's murder trial, is found shot dead in his car. Reginald Holmes was scheduled to appear at the coroner's inquiry, as well as the much-anticipated trial of Brady. However, Holmes would not live long enough to give his testimony. In the early hours of the very morning of the coroner's inquiry, Holmes was found shot dead in his car on Hickson Road, Dawes Point, near Sydney Harbour Bridge. This desolate, run-down area was somewhere that law-abiding citizens tended to avoid. It was reputed to be a favorite meeting point for local smugglers, a place where money and contraband speedily changed hands. The passenger door of Holmes' Nash sedan was ajar, and the position of his wounds indicated that he had been shot 3 times by someone sitting in the passenger seat. Moreover, there were no signs of a struggle, implying that Holmes had been murdered by somebody he knew well enough to allow into his car. Mrs. Holmes. Following Holmes' murder, his wife came forward to divulge what she knew, and in lieu of her murdered husband, became the key witness in the trial. She said that on April 8, Patrick Brady had visited their home. His arms were cut and bloody, and he carried a knapsack that she recognized as belonging to Smith. A taxi driver would later corroborate her story, telling investigators that, on that same date, he had driven Brady from Cronulla to Holmes' home in North Sydney. After Brady left, Holmes told his wife that Brady had murdered Smith, dismembered him, and put it in a tin trunk, put it in a boat, and tipped it overboard. 1. He had a hand in a pocket and wouldn't take it out. It was clear he was frightened. A taxi driver testifies at the trial of Patrick Brady. A majority of the detectives in the Sydney Homicide Squad believed that Brady somehow forgot about Smith's telltale tattooed arm when packing the trunk with the rest of his dismembered remains. Realizing his mistake, he later disposed of it, whereupon it was swallowed by the shark. Others theorized that Brady had retained Smith's arm as evidence, in order to convince Holmes that the gruesome deed had been done before disposing of it. Rejected testimony. The Supreme Court ruled that an arm did not constitute a body, which was required for a murder conviction, and thus there was no way of knowing if James Smith was deceased or not. The judge also refused to accept Mrs. Holmes' testimony, regarding it only as hearsay. September 12, 1935 Patrick Brady is formally acquitted of the murder of Reginald Holmes. The generally accepted theory is that when the insurance company refused to pay out after the suspicious sinking of Holmes' yacht, Smith and Holmes fell out, and Smith threatened to expose Holmes as a criminal. James Smith's wife testified that she found an entry in her husband's black pocketbook that Reginald Holmes had owed him £60 or £65, $5,300 or $5,800 in US dollars today. She said she could not be sure how the debt was incurred. However, it is possible that this was the amount Holmes owed Smith for the boat insurance scheme that went awry. In a bid to save his reputation, Holmes hired Brady to put Smith away for good, and Brady shot Smith dead in his rented cottage. When investigators later questioned Holmes, Brady believed that Holmes would not stand up to the pressure, so he silenced him. An intriguing alternative theory about Holmes' death was put forward by Alex Cassels in his 1995 book, The Shark Arm Murders. Cassels speculated that the outwardly respectable Holmes could have taken out a contract on his own life in order to spare his family the public shame they would have suffered if he were to be convicted of the boat insurance fraud. 2. Alex Cassels also suggested another possible suspect for the murders of Smith and Holmes. Smith had been a police informant and had pointed the finger at a Sydney gangster named Eddie Wayman in a bank robbery. Wayman was also mixed up in the local drug trade, and it is possible that Wayman killed Smith and Holmes out of revenge, and to remove rivals in the drug trade. Exposing the truth. Whoever threw James Smith's dismembered arm to the sharks and silenced Reginald Holmes has never been brought to justice. Had the trial of Patrick Brady taken place in modern times, the outcome could well have been very different. In the past, murder convictions without a body were rare, but modern developments in forensic science have made it much more likely that a conviction can be obtained today. A famous example is the conviction of Richard Crafts, who murdered his wife in Connecticut in 1986 and disposed of her body using a wood chipper. DNA technology in criminal investigation would probably have resulted in Brady being found guilty. Investigation would probably have resulted in Brady being found guilty, with or without the rest of Smith's body. As it was a 1,000,000 to 1 chance that the murder of James Smith was ever brought to light, triggering a chain of events that even the most ingenious thriller writer would have difficulty conceiving. Case notes. It was thought that the arm had actually been swallowed by the smaller shark that the tiger shark had eaten. James Smith had been missing for more than 3 weeks. Patrick Brady had several aliases, including Mr. Williams, Mr. Anderson, and Mr. Evans. On the night of Reginald Holmes' murder, a man fishing off Dawes Point claimed he heard 3 shots at around 9 o'clock or 10 p.m. 48 witnesses were subpoenaed for the murder trial of Patrick Brady. The notoriety of the shark arm case blighted Patrick Brady's life. He died in 1965, aged 71. In 1954, somebody attempted to kill James Smith's son, Raymond Smith, with a car bomb. Fortunately, no one was in the car when the bomb exploded. Story 3. In 1998, patients flocked to 52-year-old Harold Shipman, who had a thriving medical practice in Hyde, a suburb of Manchester, England. But in September of that year, Shipman was arrested for killing one of his patients. The subsequent investigation revealed that this doctor and married father of 4 was one of the most prolific serial killers in history. An official inquiry found that Shipman killed at least 215 of his patients while working as a general practitioner between 1975 and 98, and suspected his involvement in 45 more deaths. The inquiry later looked at Shipman's actions after he graduated from medical school in 1970 and found another 24 suspicious deaths dating back to 1971, which brought his suspected victim count to 284. A&E True Crime takes a look at Shipman's life and crimes, what motivated him, how he murdered his patients without getting caught, and what finally brought his killing spree to an end. Why did Harold Shipman kill his patients? One theory is that Shipman's murders were tied to his mother, who died of cancer when he was a teen. Before she passed away, doctors gave her morphine for her pain. The official inquiry noted that Shipman's preferred method of murder was to inject a patient with a deadly dose of diamorphine while visiting them in their homes. And among his confirmed 215 victims, 171 were women. However, Philip Shawn, a professor of criminology at Ontario Tech University, cautions against reading too much into who Shipman chose to kill. I would conjecture that he was shaped by access to victims, he tells A&E True Crime via email. Had he worked in an infant ward, I would conjecture that his victim selection may have been different. Beatrice Yorker, Professor Emerita of Nursing and Criminal Justice at California State University, Los Angeles, is an expert in medical serial killers who tracks and catalogs their behavior. She tells A&E True Crime, our database is up to 150 healthcare providers, worldwide, who have been prosecuted for serial murder of their patients. We have several categories of healthcare serial killers, Yorker says. We have the attention seekers, healthcare serial killers who do it for the thrill of rescuing patients in a code. But since Shipman had no witnesses, and he wasn't trying to impress his colleagues in the hospital setting, he's more in the power and control category. The official inquiry notes that Shipman's patients felt he was a compassionate doctor and appreciated his house calls. His way to control them was to endear himself to them, Yorker says. How Shipman killed for decades. Later nicknamed Angel of Death, Dr. Death and the Good Doctor in the press, Shipman might have ended his killing spree in the 1970s. In 1975, he was caught forging prescriptions for pethidine, an opioid he was addicted to, and lost his job at a West Yorkshire medical practice. Yet, after a stint in rehab, Shipman got the chance in 1977 to resume his career, which allowed him to continue to murder patients. Being a doctor provided Shipman with means and opportunities to murder. He could write orders for opiates, Yorker says. And he made home visits. We believe that the number of healthcare serial killings that happen in homes is vastly undetected. Shipman launched a solo practice in 1992, which Yorker thinks also made it easier for him to kill without raising suspicion. Many of Shipman's victims were elderly, though the official inquiry noted that most were generally healthy. As a doctor, Shipman could falsify a natural cause of death on the death certificate. He sometimes changed victims' medical records to back up his claims. Shipman killed more frequently between 1992 and 98, claiming at least 143 victims. Yorker says an increasing murder rate is common for healthcare serial murderers. What happens is, they may just kill a patient here and there, but then when they realize they're getting away with it, that emboldens them, she says. It becomes compulsive, and they start doing it more and more. In March 1998, another doctor in Hyde shared her concerns with the coroner about the high death rate among Shipman's patients. However, a brief police investigation found no wrongdoing. Caregiving serial murderers benefit from the blind spot afforded to those who care for society's most vulnerable. Enzo Yaksic, founder of the Atypical Homicide Research Group and author of Killer Data, Modern Perspectives on Serial Murder, tells A&E True Crime via email. A forgery revealed Shipman as a killer. Kathleen Grundy, 81, died on June 24, 1998. She was Shipman's patient and had apparently left behind a typewritten will naming him as her sole inheritor. However, the signature on the will didn't match Grundy's writing. After her daughter contacted the authorities, Grundy was exhumed, and investigators found excessive levels of morphine in her body. Because Grundy's will had clearly been forged, the inquiry into Shipman's actions noted the possibility that, perhaps subconsciously, Shipman had wanted someone to stop him. Initially, I hypothesized that some of them got so brazen that they might want to get caught, Yorker states. However, after everything I've studied and, as I've looked at our database, I now believe that when healthcare serial killers get sloppy, it's more out of their astonishment that they haven't been stopped so far. Then they start pushing the boundaries, like writing a will, Yorker says. And that's when they get caught. Harold Shipman's legacy. Shipman was arrested for Grundy's murder on September 7, 1998. Police conducted a more in-depth investigation of deaths among his patients and charged him with murdering 15 women between 1995 and 1998. Shipman maintained his innocence, but was found guilty of all 15 murders in January 2000. He received 15 life sentences. Even post-conviction, Shipman never explained his actions or gave authorities a full list of his victims. Though the official inquiry concluded he was definitely responsible for 215 murders and linked him to a total of 284 deaths, a lack of evidence meant they couldn't reach a conclusion about Shipman's involvement in dozens of patient deaths. Yaksic says it's often impossible to uncover the full scope of a caregiving serial murderer's actions. On January 13, 2004, one day before he would have turned 58, Shipman hanged himself with a bedsheet in his prison cell at His Majesty's Prison Wakefield in Wakefield, West Yorkshire. 2 decades have passed since his death, but Shipman remains a stark example of the risks posed by medical serial murderers. It's too easy for them to kill, Yorker says. It can be months between killings for garden-variety serial killers, where a healthcare serial killer can knock off 5 patients in a day. Story 4. For 33 years, New York City police detectives ignored Pedro Hernandez. Despite his name being in their reports as someone who worked in the area where 6-year-old Aiden Katz had vanished in 1979, they never contacted him or interviewed him. The husband and father did not become a person of interest in one of the most memorable unsolved murders in Manhattan's history until 2012, when a suspicious relative called the police. Hernandez's brother-in-law, seeing reports of an investigation into another man for the crime, called police with a tip. Hernandez had spoken over the years about killing a boy in New York City. But no one from his family, his prayer group or his co-workers took him seriously. During about 7 hours of questioning, Hernandez told detectives what they wanted to hear. While working as an 18-year-old stock clerk at a bodega at West Broadway and Prince Street, not far from Aiden's bus stop, he lured the boy inside for a soda. Hernandez told detectives he attacked Aiden in the basement, where something took over me. I grabbed him by the neck, and I started to choke him, Hernandez told the investigators. Hernandez said Aiden was still alive when he stuffed him into a plastic bag that he shoved inside a box and discarded a block away. No one ever saw Aiden again. His body was never found. Soon after the confession, police announced the 51-year-old Hernandez's arrest, bringing relief to Aiden's family and a lower Manhattan neighborhood once gripped with fear following the boy's disappearance. Aiden headed out alone. It was May 25, 1979, a Friday heading into Memorial Day weekend. Aiden asked his mother, Julie, if he could walk to the bus himself. It was only a couple of blocks away in their Soho neighborhood. So, for the first time, she allowed her independent son to head out alone. "It's fine, Mom," he told her. Carrying a school bag decorated with elephants, and $1 to buy a soda on the way, Aiden took off. He never made it to the bus or school. Police swarmed their neighborhood that afternoon with bloodhounds. Flyers with the 3-foot-4-inch blonde-haired, blue-eyed boy's face hit shop windows. Frightened parents kept their children close. 4 years later, without a trace of the boy and no suspects arrested, President Ronald Reagan declared May 25 the first National Missing Children's Day. Aiden's disappearance helped establish the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Missing children's faces began appearing on milk cartons. Focus on a convicted child molester. For many years, police keyed on one suspect, Jose Ramos, a convicted child molester in a relationship with a woman hired to walk Aiden home from school. Ramos denied involvement but acknowledged that he encountered a boy that could have been Aiden in a park the same day Aiden vanished. Ramos had a propensity for kids that looked just like Aiden and sexually abused them, Hernandez's attorney, Harvey Fishbein, tells A&E True Crime. He was clearly a primary suspect. Believing Ramos was their guy, detectives focused on him for years. But the investigation went nowhere. Search for a body continues. In 2012, police tore up a handyman's basement on Prince Street. Othniel Miller, who denied involvement in Aiden's case, acknowledged he knew Aiden. Miller, detectives discovered, had poured a concrete floor after Aiden disappeared. News media surrounded the building as jackhammers turned the floor into rubble. Detectives found nothing but animal bones. News coverage leads to breaks. News coverage of the dig, however, triggered results. New Jersey resident Jose Lopez called detectives with suspicions about Hernandez. Shortly after Aiden disappeared, Lopez told them, Hernandez said he had killed a child. Hernandez told the same story to his church group, his wife, and a childhood friend. Even before police turned on their video camera and read Hernandez his Miranda rights during questioning, Hernandez confessed. "I never meant to hurt their child," Hernandez told them. "I hope they can forgive me." Based on Hernandez's confession and other statements to people he knew, prosecutors took the case to trial without a body, forensic evidence, or even a motive. A first trial ended with jurors deadlocked 11-1 in favor of guilt. A second trial concluded in 2017 resulted in a second-degree murder conviction. At that trial, Aiden's father, Stanley Patz, angrily addressed Hernandez. "After all these years, we finally know what dark secret you kept locked in your heart," Patz said. "You took our precious child and threw him in the garbage. I will never forgive you. The God you pray to will never forgive you. You are the monster in your nightmares and will join your father in hell." He also said it's about time that Hernandez was convicted. A judge sentenced Hernandez to 25 years to life in prison. His attorneys appealed, but a New York appellate court ruled the verdict was based on legally sufficient evidence and Hernandez's confession was reliable and truthful. Attorney claims Pedro Hernandez is innocent. Hernandez's attorney, Fishbein, believes an injustice occurred. "We certainly don't have a video of Pedro's life, but nothing points to him having done this, other than his own words," Fishbein says. His own words were totally unreliable. Fishbein argues today, as he did at trial, that Hernandez suffered from schizotypal personality disorder, a condition like schizophrenia that made him weird, quirky, different, aloof. He took antipsychotic medication. His IQ was about 70. Fishbein says Hernandez somehow developed a fixated picture in his mind about the killing, and through the hours of questioning, admitted to something he did not do. He had no previous criminal background. Focus on Ramos, he told the jury, trying to destroy Hernandez's credibility. Clearly he was wrongfully convicted, because I don't believe the evidence was there, Fishbein says. I also believe that he's an innocent man. Hernandez's legal team contended police violated his constitutional rights to self-incrimination. After a New York State appellate court upheld the conviction, a federal appeal, mostly based on constitutional claims, failed in 2024 in U.S. District Court. Attorneys have appealed to the U.S. Court of Appeals, Second Circuit. Fishbein says he speaks to Hernandez regularly, but he will not discuss his private talks. New York prison records show Hernandez is currently serving his sentence at the Elmira Correctional Facility in Elmira, New York. He will be eligible for parole in 2037. There's a million issues here, Fishbein says. When someone confesses to something, jurors have a very hard time believing that they didn't do it. Why would someone confess? Well, you try to show them the psychiatric situation and that they had these fantasies and beliefs that it could be implanted. But for whatever reason, the jury convicted. This was a very, very emotional case here in New York. Story 5. Monique Smith couldn't get her birth certificate. Smith asked for the document dozens of times over her life, but each time, her mother refused to provide it. Without her birth certificate, Smith couldn't join the Marines or Baltimore's police department. She couldn't go to college. For years, Smith worked for Johns Hopkins Hospital reviewing medical claims, just praying every day they weren't going to ask for an ID, she says. Smith had enough. She launched what would become a decades-long quest for the document. And in her search for answers, everything Smith thought was true about her life unraveled. Smith grew up in Baltimore with an abusive mother and two of her, now deceased, uncles who she claims raped her for more than a dozen years. To escape the trauma, an 18-year-old Smith fled to Florida, where she fell into sex work. She eventually married, moved, got divorced and started a new life. I wanted to live the story I wanted told, not the one that I was forced to be in, she says. The more Smith searched for answers, the more questions arose. Smith discovered that her mother had sought multiple replacement social security cards for her daughter, each under a different name. Smith's relatives couldn't tell her where she was born or who her father was. Smith finally realized, the family who raised her wasn't her family at all. This woman had snatched me from New York, at the age of 1, Smith tells A&E True Crime. Smith called the National Center of Missing and Exploited Children and asked the agency to add her to its list of missing children. They said, "What do you mean?" I said, "I'm a missing kid. I'm just all grown up. There's got to be someone in your database looking for a baby," she recalls. She became missing child number 120-1258. Later, a DNA analysis revealed Smith's biological family. Her mother, who had died years before, was from New York, and Smith had 6 sisters. And finally, at 55 years old, Smith got her birth certificate. She was born Symbolus Ruffin. "I'm glad they didn't see me wallow in self-pity," Smith, now 58, says. A lot of people are looking for validation instead of tapping into their own self-love. It's hard for people to love themselves if they haven't been loved. But you have to try to find what makes you happy. The Lifetime original movie on Smith's life, Not My Family, The Monique Smith Story, premieres on April 12 and will be available to stream in the Lifetime app the next day. Ahead of its release, Smith spoke with A&E True Crime about her journey of discovering her real identity, having to convince people to help her along the way and what justice looks like for her. How does the abuse you experienced throughout your life impact you today? I use it for strength. I use that pain and turn it into purpose. There are so many children who are being sexually abused, physically abused, mentally abused, being abducted and trafficked. I use all that pain because it doesn't go away. I have triggers. People say, you need to heal, but you can't challenge the timeline that it takes people to heal. In my case, it's going to last a lifetime. This was 16, 17 years of abuse, and then I went right into another realm of abuse, prostitution, running away from one situation into the next. How did you survive that abuse? You're a child. You don't know. I was abducted at 1. I didn't notice until I was almost 30 that I was abducted. The family that I was with, I assumed they were my biological family. I was sexually abused at 3 and 4, up until I was 18, by multiple people in the family. A lot of us children, we don't realize that what is happening to us is wrong. Our goal is to not disturb the environment, do what you're told. Don't do anything to make them want to harm you. In my case, if it was raining, I would get abused because it was raining. That environment is so unpredictable. How advice do you give people who are in those situations, or see them? When I go to high schools and middle schools and youth programs, I tell them, tell and tell until people believe you. I shared my story when I was 15 and 16. It paralyzes some people. Some people don't know what to do to help you. So, I always say, tell until you get some resources. There was this moment, this split second, that I revealed to someone who came into the home that I had been abused. I had been beaten with a 2x4. I lifted up a mattress to show them the 2x4. I showed them the bruises on my back. They grabbed their mouth and gasped. But they never said anything. They just left. That was my one signal in the midst of all of this. They could have gotten me out, taken me to the authorities. But they didn't do anything. There are people witnessing these horrific acts, but they don't know what to do. I tell them, write an anonymous letter. Make an anonymous phone call. Use somebody else's phone to call in a tip. The people who watched what happened to me have told me, as an adult, your mother was a bit rough. She was a bit firm. No, I almost died. Hopefully, that's a message that is going to trigger someone who's witnessing something right now to put a stop to the abuse. What was it like to play detective when you're the subject of your investigation? It was the oddest thing, me coming in as the evidence and trying to convince people that I was the living proof that I was a missing child. There's this idea that all missing children are dead. It was shocking to every entity that I went to, the FBI, CIA, police departments, you name it. It sounds like you had a really difficult time convincing people to help you. It was a struggle. It was also a time when identity theft was huge. I was told, how do we know you're not trying to falsify paperwork? You could be a criminal, trying to obtain a new identity. I was really shocked, but I also understood their role, so, it wasn't like I was angry and frustrated. When you finally got your birth certificate and got at least one of the answers you had been searching for, did anything change for you in that moment? Or has it since? No, actually. I was thriving for so long, I was at the point that a piece of paper didn't matter to me anymore. My legal name, it mattered. But I wasn't going to let it consume me. If I had died before I found out, I needed to be okay. When I got that paper, it was definitely a reward. But it was also like I had to start over. Like, am I 1 year old now? What do I do? How do I condense 50-something years into a name I just received in a day? Are you still in contact with anyone from your childhood? I'm not really close with that family, except for one person who raised me. For that person, it was a shock to learn that their biological father, their biological relatives, committed these horrendous acts of harm against me. You have 6 siblings in your biological family. What is your relationship like with them? I did meet all of my sisters, but everyone is living such different lives. We all know each other. We can reach out to each other. What have you learned from them about what might have happened to you? Not one bit. My birth mother was a substance abuser, a drinker. She had 7 kids by 7 different men. People say, how do you know that your mother didn't sell you? No woman with 7 kids is going to get rid of one child. The woman who stole me said to me, verbatim, I'm going to my grave before you know anything. If my mother had sold me, then this woman would have said, your mother was on drugs, and I gave her a couple of dollars for you. But she hid what she did. When she said that to you, essentially, I'm taking these secrets to my grave, and then, she died, did you feel a sense of loss? That she took something with her you may never know? No, I was already disconnected from her and my childhood. This was a woman who, if I would walk into a room, she would throw something at my head for no reason whatsoever. So, when she said that, I had no feeling. It was almost like, yeah, you would do something like that. I never could get that woman arrested. I gathered so many things with her signatures on them, falsified documents. I tried to get her locked up. I wanted justice, but it never worked. Is there justice for you, and what does that justice look like at this point? I couldn't stop what happened to me, and I can't change my past. But if I can make sure there's justice for other people, that's justice for me. Story 6. In the days after writer Susan Berman was discovered dead in her Beverly Hills home, suspicion quickly fell on members of the Las Vegas crime syndicate once run by her father as well as her agent, with whom Berman allegedly had a tumultuous relationship. But the real story of Berman's murder turned out to be even more outlandish. Robert Allen Durst, the eccentric millionaire and heir to a Manhattan real estate dynasty that runs the World Trade Center, murdered Berman as part of an alleged killing spree that spanned 4 decades and left 3 people dead. According to law enforcement authorities, the spree began in 1982, when Durst allegedly murdered his 29-year-old wife, Kathleen McCormick. McCormick disappeared from the couple's New York home after weeks of marital discord. Though her body was never recovered, she was declared dead in 2017. 18 years after McCormick's disappearance, Durst shot Berman execution style in what prosecutors said was an attempt to keep his wife's murder a secret. Berman, Durst's longtime friend, knew he had killed McCormick and threatened to expose him, they said. Police discovered Berman's body in a pool of blood after receiving a handwritten letter penned by Durst, which included her address and the word cadaver written in capital letters. Finally, in 2001, after months of posing as a mute, elderly woman living in a Galveston, Texas, boarding house, Durst was accused of shooting 71-year-old neighbor Morris Black, then using a saw and carving knife to cut his body into pieces. Durst allegedly disposed of the corpse in Galveston Bay. But a Texas jury acquitted him. A 2015 documentary series, The Jinx, The Life and Deaths of Robert Durst, finally lead to Durst's undoing. A hot microphone caught Durst apparently confessing to Berman's murder. A Los Angeles jury convicted Durst of Berman's murder on September 17, 2021. He was sentenced to life in prison, but died only months later due to natural causes at age 78. Even before Durst's trial began in Los Angeles County Superior Court, Judge Mark E. Wyndham declared, "I've never seen a more interesting case in my career." A&E True Crime looks back at some of the most memorable moments from a trial 4 decades in the making. A charming psychopath. Durst's notoriety presented unique challenges for prosecutors and defense attorneys who hoped to seat a non-biased jury. To whittle a pool of potential jurors from 1,000 to 23, including 11 alternates, attorneys asked a series of questions meant to determine views on everything from wealth to gun ownership. But what they really needed to know was, how did prospective jurors feel about Durst? One contender declared Durst a charming psychopath. One called him dangerous. Another said Durst was guilty not only of killing Berman, but of slaying McCormick and Black too. After weeks of exhaustive questioning, 8 women and 4 men were sworn into the jury. The trial's 14-month hiatus. Starting in March 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic crippled courts across the country, halting jury trials and pausing in-person proceedings for months. The Los Angeles County Superior Court, where Durst was tried, was no exception. In fact, Durst's trial had begun only days before the court shuttered. His trial wouldn't begin again for another 14 months. When the trial resumed on May 17, 2021, the judge allowed attorneys to address the jury a second time. "I have never given an opening statement in the same case twice," lead prosecutor John Lewin said. Delayed by a catheter. In what prosecutors claimed was yet another ploy in Durst's arsenal of evasions, his attorneys asked the judge to delay his trial because he had bladder cancer. As a result, they said, he'd suffered a urinary tract infection and had been fitted with a catheter. As proof, Durst held up his catheter bag in the courtroom. Seated in a wheelchair, the gaunt, 78-year-old Durst did not persuade prosecutors that he was too ill to proceed. Arguing against the proposed delay, Lewin offered to change Durst's catheter bag for him. Wyndham denied the defense attorney's request. But when the trial resumed, Wyndham ordered a blanket be placed over Durst's lap. "One doesn't ordinarily meet with the public with a catheter bag in full view," the judge said. Durst's testimony worked against him. Nearly 2 decades earlier, in 2003, Durst had testified in his own defense in a Texas courtroom, claiming he had killed his elderly neighbor, Black, because he was in fear of his life. Durst said he shot Black accidentally in a frenzied scuffle for his handgun, after he found Black inside his apartment holding the weapon. After shooting Black in the head, Durst testified that he chopped up Black's body, wrapped the pieces in plastic and dumped them in Galveston Bay. That jury acquitted him of Black's murder, but convicted him of destroying evidence. At his trial on Behrman slaying, Durst once again opted to take the witness stand. But his testimony didn't work in his favor. Instead, Lewin relentlessly questioned Durst, eventually forcing him to admit that he'd lied under oath about Behrman's killing. After nearly 40 hours of cross-examination, a weary Judge Wyndham instructed Lewin to stop. "At some point, there's a limit," he said. Durst's confession on tape. By the end of the trial, 80 witnesses had testified and nearly 300 exhibits were entered into evidence. But the most damning evidence came from Durst himself. In final interview for the documentary series The Jinx, Andrew Uretsky, the director, presented Durst with the envelope from the cadaver letter that was sent to police after Behrman's death. Uretsky also showed Durst an envelope that Durst had used to send Behrman a letter years before her death. On both envelopes, Uretsky pointed out, Beverly Hills was misspelled Beverly Hills. Handwriting experts believed the same person wrote both letters, Uretsky told Durst. Shaken, Durst went to the restroom with his microphone still attached. There, hidden from the cameras, he confessed to all the murders. "What the hell did I do? Killed them all, of course," he said. Durst added, "It was her or me. I had no choice." Prosecutors later used Durst's words against him. Habib Balian, who prosecuted Durst with Lewin, said in his closing statement that Durst's recorded confession says it all. Story 7. The perks of fame are obvious. While most people toil away in obscurity, a select few have the privilege of being adored by millions. But that adoration can come with a steep price. The more people who know you, the more unwell people who know you, too. Some people's fandom leads them to dark places where love and obsession results in murder. A&E True Crime looks at a few of the most notorious cases of fans murdering the celebrities they once adored. Yolanda Saldivar kills Selena Quintanilla Perez. Known to her admirers simply by her first name, Selena, the 23-year-old Grammy Award-winning singer reigned as the queen of the Tejano music world when she was gunned down by the president of her own fan club on March 31, 1995. Her assassin, Yolanda Saldivar, had met the Texas-born vocalist in 1991, after introducing herself to Selena's father, Abraham Quintanilla, Jr., with the idea of starting a Selena fan club. Soon after she started the club and became its president, it grew into the most successful Selena fan club in the San Antonio area. And as Selena's popularity grew, Saldivar earned more responsibility with the family, including managing some of Selena's businesses. But then some in the fan club lodged complaints with Quintanilla, saying they had paid Saldivar membership fees and received nothing in return. Quintanilla confronted Saldivar in early March of 1995 and told her he would go to police with allegations of embezzlement. 3 weeks later, as Selena met with Saldivar to get some financial documents, Saldivar shot and killed her. Saldivar was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 30 years. She filed her first petition for parole in January 2025, which was denied on March 27, 2025. The Texas Board of Pardons and Parole said in a statement, after a thorough consideration of all available information, which included any confidential interviews conducted, it was the parole panel's determination to deny parole to Yolanda Saldivar and set her next parole review for March 2030. The reason provided by the panel for denial was the nature of the offense. The record indicates that the instant offense has elements of brutality, violence, assaultive behavior, or conscious selection of victims' vulnerability, indicating a conscious disregard for the lives, safety, or property of others, such that the offender poses a continuing threat to public safety. Mark David Chapman kills John Lennon. John Lennon was a creative force behind the Beatles, the best-selling band in history. In their heyday, the Beatles were so big that Lennon said his band was more popular than Jesus in 1966. That offhand remark drew widespread condemnation, especially in the American South, where a Ban the Beatles campaign led to boycotts and record burnings. The comment would also eventually grab the attention of Beatles fan Mark David Chapman, who would gun down Lennon outside Lennon's New York City apartment building on December 8, 1980, 14 years after Lennon made the comment. In an interview from prison, Chapman would say that a born-again religious conversion led him to view Lennon's Jesus comments as blasphemous, a motivating factor in his decision to end the musician's life. Chapman was arrested outside Lennon's home with a copy of J.D. Salinger, The Catcher in the Rye, which he quoted from at his trial. Chapman claimed to have identified with the book's main character, Holden Caulfield, who traveled throughout New York City complaining about phonies. He pleaded guilty to the murder and was sentenced to 20 years to life. As of time of publication, he remains incarcerated at Green Haven Correctional Facility in upstate New York. A Strawberry Fields memorial to Lennon was created in Central Park near Lennon's home months after his death. Robert Bardo kills Rebecca Schaffer. Rebecca Schaffer, a 21-year-old up-and-coming actress, lost her life after being gunned down outside her West Hollywood home on July 18, 1989. A model-turned-TV actress who had appeared in both sitcoms, like My Sister Sam, and soap operas, such as One Life to Live, Schaffer was scheduled to audition for Francis Ford Coppola's The Godfather 3 on the day she was murdered. Her assassin, 19-year-old Robert Bardo, had been obsessing over her for years. A high school dropout from Tucson, Bardo studied and then copied how other celebrity stalkers had committed their crimes when planning his, like paying a private investigator to get Schaefer's address for him. He claims he felt personally betrayed by Schaffer after she appeared in a love scene in the movie Scenes from the Class Struggles in Beverly Hills. Only blocks from the crime scene, police recovered a copy of The Catcher in the Rye, an homage Bardo left for Mark David Chapman. Bardo, who was prosecuted by Marcia Clark, was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for his crime. He's currently incarcerated at the Avenal State Prison in California. Public outcry following Schaefer slaying led to the nation's first anti-stalking laws. Humberto Castro Muñoz kills Andrés Escobar. To the American public, Andrés Escobar was lesser known than those who precede him on this list. But to soccer fanatics around the world and especially in his native Colombia, the center-back was an enormous star, helping usher in a golden age of Colombian soccer, when that country's national team became a real contender at the 1994 World Cup. On the eve of that tournament, soccer legend Pelé called the squad the very best in the field. Expectations were sky high. But Colombia underperformed spectacularly at the tournament, quickly being eliminated after losing 2 of their 3 matches. Escobar became the defining image of that underperformance, accidentally scoring against his own team, an own goal, in the squad's pivotal second loss, against host United States. For that error, Escobar was shot and killed 10 days later, leaving a nightclub in his home city of Medellin. Eyewitnesses said that the gunman shouted "Goal, goal" with every shot he took at the 27-year-old. The killer was later identified as Humberto Castro Muñoz, a bodyguard and driver who had connections to a Colombian drug cartel. Although the motive wasn't identified, one of the prevailing theories pointed to a retaliation for the accidental goal on behalf of Colombian drug lords who suffered huge gambling losses. After admitting to the murder, Muñoz received a 43-year prison sentence, later reduced to 26 years. He was released after serving about 11 years. Nathan Gale kills dimebag Darrell Abbott. Musician Darrell Lance Abbott, known by his stage name Dimebag Darrell, helped launch heavy metal band Pantera to stardom in the 1980s and 1990s with his virtuosic guitar playing. But in 2003, the band broke up, prompting heartbreak for some of their devoted listeners. One obsessed fan, Nathan Gale, may have held Abbott personally responsible for that breakup. That appears to be why the 25-year-old went to assassinate Dimebag Darrell while he performed with his new band, Damage Plan, at the All Rosa Villa nightclub in Columbus, Ohio, less than 1 year later. A former Marine, Gale rushed the stage with a gun, killing Abbott and 3 others, before an officer responding to the scene shot and killed him. Story 8. On November 16, 1957, investigators in Plainfield, Wisconsin, discovered a gruesome scene at the family farm where Ed Gain had spent his entire life. Inside a shed, detectives found the headless and disemboweled body of Bernice Worden, a local hardware store owner Gain had murdered earlier that day. When they entered the main house, they tracked down Worden's head and heart, along with dozens of female body parts from corpses Gain had dug up in a 5-year span. His grave digging started 2 years after his mother, Augusta, died in 1945. Gain, a notorious killer who inspired the Norman Bates character in the novel Psycho and who was later referred to as the Butcher of Plainfield in the media, confessed to killing Worden and another woman, Mary Hogan, as well as stealing 9 female corpses. Shortly after his arrest, psychiatrists diagnosed him Gain schizophrenia and had him committed to a mental hospital for the next decade, after which he was found fit to stand trial. A jury ruled him not guilty by reason of insanity, and he was sent back to a mental institution until his death in 1984. Gain claimed his 2 victims and the dead women he dug up resembled Augusta. Gruesome evidence of Gain's horrific acts, skins from human heads, stuffed faces on the walls, boxes of nipples and noses were strewn throughout his home, except for one bedroom. When you look at the crime scene photos, his house was an absolute disaster. Louis Schlesinger, a psychology professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, tells A&E True Crime. But his mother's room was immaculate, just as it was when she died. The pristine state of Augusta's bedroom was a signpost pointing to how Gain's obsessive relationship with his mother partly shaped his criminal behavior. Schlesinger says, "Did he have a very abnormal relationship with his mother?" It doesn't take Sigmund Freud to conclude that the answer is obviously yes. Gain's strict upbringing while isolated on the farm. Augusta kept a tight rein on Ed and his older brother, Henry, during their childhood and adolescent years. Their father, George, was an alcoholic who pawned off parenting duties to Augusta, a devout Christian, causing constant friction in the marriage. Carol Lieberman, a forensic psychiatrist, tells A&E True Crime. Preaching from a Bible, their mother taught Ed and Henry that booze and dating women would lead them down a path of immorality. She also prevented her boys from having any social interactions with other children outside of school and kept them busy with chores around the farm, Lieberman says. According to Lieberman, the isolation likely caused Gain to develop an Oedipus complex, a diagnosis of a strong emotional attachment to the parent of the opposite sex, that would play a role in his decisions as an adult to rob graves and murder 2 women. Gain had a sexual, romantic attraction to his mother, Lieberman says. And the family's isolation on the farm only grew his dependence on her and his attraction to her. The fact that she hated her husband made her more reliant on her sons for companionship, she adds. So, there was a part of her that was nurturing this dependency on her sons. When they reached adulthood, Henry became more independent from Augusta, while Ed's fixation with their mother continued. In 1944, 4 years after George's death, Henry died while he and his brother were putting out a fire near the farm. Coroners ruled Henry asphyxiated from smoke inhalation, but his head had bruises consistent with being struck. Gain told police he had become separated from his brother while battling the blaze. After the brother died, the mother had 2 paralyzing strokes, so she couldn't go anywhere, Lieberman says. He would have had her all to himself. In his confession to investigators, Gain claimed that a force built up in me in the years following his mother's passing in 1945. He said he visited local cemeteries to dig up fresh graves with recently deceased women so he could sew a woman's suit in order to physically recreate his mother and become her. He wanted to crawl into her skin, Lieberman says. The body parts he had collected weren't sufficient, so he had to kill these 2 women, according to his confession. Gain's mental illness. Gain's Oedipal relationship with his mother influenced his decisions to steal corpses and kill Hogan and Worden. But his mental illnesses are the likely root causes for his behavior, both Lieberman and Schlesinger say. His schizophrenia made him feel very lonely and abandoned by his mother and perhaps is why he heard voices telling him to get another mother, Lieberman says. After he was caught, some former classmates described his strange mannerisms, including seemingly random laughter, as if he were laughing at his own personal jokes. That would have been auditory hallucinations, and he was probably having a little conversation in his head with these voices. Schlesinger notes that psychiatrists who diagnosed Gain in the time period between his arrest and his trial didn't have the experience and tools to deal with a deranged killer that mental health experts have today. In the 1950s, these were very extraordinary crimes and were not on anybody's radar when they happened, Schlesinger says. In Gain's case, he was probably dealing with several very disturbed psychopathologies. While his only meaningful relationship with a domineering, religiously devout mother influenced his decisions in the type of corpses and women he targeted, it's not the sole reason that caused his necrophilia and murderous impulses, Schlesinger says. But he was psychotic and out of touch with reality. Story 9. As a child, Gypsy Rose Blanchard's life was claustrophobically small. A victim of Munchausen syndrome by proxy, Gypsy endured chronic abuse by her malignantly controlling mother, Claudine D.D. Blanchard. D.D. would imagine that her daughter was suffering from extreme diseases, and then force the child into extreme treatment, a feeding tube, a wheelchair, the surgical removal of her salivary glands. To escape the abuse, Gypsy Rose enlisted the help of a boyfriend, Nicholas Godjohn, who stabbed D.D. to death. Godjohn was charged with first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison plus 25 years. But due, in part, to the extreme and abnormal child abuse Gypsy had suffered, the prosecution offered her a more lenient plea deal for her role in the murder. She was charged with second-degree murder and freed on parole in December 2023 after serving 8.5 years. After her release, Gypsy Rose went to live with her husband, Ryan Anderson, whom she married while still behind bars. However, she soon reconnected with an ex-boyfriend, Ken Urker. Her first child with Urker, a daughter named Aurora Reyna Urker, was born on December 28, 2024. A little over a year after her release, Gypsy Rose spoke with A&E True Crime about her new life as a free woman and a new mother. New episodes of Gypsy Rose, Life After Lockup premiere Mondays at 10/9 on Lifetime and stream the next day in the Lifetime app. You've had quite a year. As you settle into your new life on the outside, do you spend much time thinking about the crime that landed you in prison nearly a decade ago? I see a few therapists a few times a month. And one thing we cover is my trauma. Working through the past is going to be a forever journey for me. That's not something that ends with my parole, that's through the rest of my life. I want to dive into more of my past than the trauma of the crime, and how I make my past not affect my present. That's something I'm working on, and it's not something someone gets overnight. But it's more about how I'll be different from my mom. Do you have regrets? Yes. I think about how I should have reached out to my dad. I look at my past and think about how I could have done this and that. I put a lot of criticism on myself. And I think the public does too. Why didn't you go for help, that kind of thing. And I don't think they understand the mindset of a victim. You really do kind of bond with your abuser. And you feel like nobody else will love you but them. That's not something most people have experienced. And I'm glad they haven't. Since leaving prison, you've become a mother. How has that affected you? It's made me a lot more mature. It's made me really have to analyze my priorities. Coming out of prison, I wanted to do this and go there and have this experience and that experience and be very carefree. I was to the wind, acting on emotion and impulse. But I have a child now. And so, I'm a lot more mindful about my decisions in life because they affect her as well. Some people say becoming a parent makes you look at your own childhood and your own parents in a different way. Has that been your experience? It has. Some negative. I wish I could say that I can relate to my mom. I wish I could give you that answer, that I see her point of view now. But that's just not it. It just isn't. If anything, I see that I'm more lost in the questions that I have. I just don't have the mindset that my mom did, to relate to her. Have you thought about how you'll tell your daughter about your own family history, when she's older? When that time comes, obviously we don't have to have that discussion right away. We plan to reach out to a child therapist who can guide us as we slowly introduce that to her. We knew that would come about. And doing that with a therapist is probably the smartest way. Are you doing any advocacy work with Munchausen by proxy? I want to. Over the last year, a lot has happened in my life, and so I wanted to wait until I did get to the point where it was something I could handle. Now things are starting to slow down. There's a lot I want to do, but I'm also giving myself grace. I've only been out a year. Let me put my feet on the ground first, put my mask on myself first before putting a mask on someone else. Something that comes up a lot on your show, Gypsy Rose, Life After Lockup, is the impact celebrity has on your life. You're understandably bothered by the criticism you receive from the public, but since you're actively seeking out the public eye, do you see a benefit in living your life openly, like this? It's always been a love/hate relationship. I choose to put myself in the public eye for the purpose of showing what I can do. I feel like everybody has taken my voice from me. And taken my power. And the show has given that power back to me. I take control of the narrative and say, this is how I'm feeling right now. I can say what happened, viewers can see it happen, and there's nothing that gets lost in translation. Story 10. In the year 1885, Jean Bott, a native of Hesse Kassel, Germany, emigrated with his wife Matilda to this country, bringing with him a celebrated violin known as the Duke of Cambridge Stradivarius, which he had purchased in 1873 for about 3,000 thalers, a sum representing practically the savings of a lifetime. Bott had been leader of a small orchestra in Saxe-Meiningen as early as 1860, and was well advanced in years before he determined to seek his fortune in America. His wife was an elderly woman and they had no offspring. This violin, my husband and myself made up the family. I loved it like a child, she testified at the trial. So also did Bott, the old musician, love his instrument, and no hand but his own was ever permitted to lift it from its case or dust its darkly glowing surface. Whatever may have been its owner's genius, he prospered little in the New World. And, although he labored conscientiously at his profession, the year 1894 found him still giving lessons upon the violin to only half a dozen pupils, and living in 2 rooms at 355 West 31st Street. But Bott, having the soul of a true musician, cared but little for money and was happy enough so long as he could smoke his old meerschaum pipe and draw the bow across the cherished violin, held lovingly to his cheek. Then hard times came a-knocking at the door. The meager account in the savings bank grew smaller and smaller. The landlord, the doctor and the grocer had to be paid. One night Bott laid down his pipe and, taking his wife's wrinkled hand in his, said gently, "Matilda, there is nothing else, we must sell our violin." "Even so," she answered, turning away her face that her husband might not see the tears. "As God wills." The next day the Duke of Cambridge Stradivarius was offered for sale by Victor S. Flechter, a friend of Bott's, who was a dealer in musical instruments at 23 Union Square. It so happened that Niccolini, the husband of Adelina Patti, was ambitious to own a genuine Stradivarius, and had been looking for one for a long time, and, although he was but an indifferent player, he had, in default of skill to perform, the money to buy. The matter was easily adjusted by Flechter, and Niccolini drew his check for the sum specified, which, properly certified, was tendered to Bott. But Bott had never seen a certified check and was unaccustomed to the ways of business. "If I part with my violin I must have real money, money that I can feel, money that I can count. It was that kind of money that I paid for my violin," said he doggedly. Niccolini, in a rage, believing himself insulted, tore the check to bits and declared the transaction at an end. Now the price agreed upon for the violin had been $4,500, of which Flechter was to receive $500 as his commission, and when, through old Professor Bott's stubbornness, the sale fell through, the dealer was naturally very angry. Out of this incident grew the case against Flechter. The old musician was accustomed to leave his treasured instrument in the lowest drawer of his bureau at the boarding house. He always removed it before his pupils arrived and never put it back until their departure, thus ensuring the secrecy of its hiding place, and only his wife, his sister-in-law, Mollenhauer, a friend, and Cloten, a prospective purchaser, knew where it lay. On the morning of March 31, 1894, not long after the Niccolini incident, Bott gave a single lesson to a pupil at the boarding house, and after his midday meal, set out with his wife for Hoboken to visit a friend. The violin was left in its customary place. It was dark when they returned, and after throwing off his coat and lighting the gas, the old man hastened to make sure that his precious violin was safe. When he pulled out the drawer it was empty. The Stradivarius was gone, with its leather case, its 2 bows and its wooden box. Half distracted, the musician and his wife searched everywhere in the room, in closets, under beds, even behind the curtains, before they could bring themselves to admit that the violin had in fact disappeared. Frantically Bott called for Ellen, the servant girl. Yes, there had been a caller, a young man with dark hair and a small, dark mustache, at about 5 o'clock. He had waited about half an hour, and then had said that he guessed he would go. She had not noticed that he took Anything away with him. In his despair the old man turned to his old friend Flector, and the next day the dealer came to express his sympathy. He urged Bot to notify the police of the theft, but the old man was prostrate with grief. And it was the wife who, with Ellen Clancy, finally accompanied Flector to police headquarters. The police had no idea who had taken the old fellow's fiddle, and did not particularly care anyway. Later they cared a good deal. Bot now began an endless and almost hopeless search for his beloved instrument, visiting every place where violins were sold, every pawn shop and second-hand store again and again until the proprietors began to think the old man must be crazy. Sometimes Flector went with him. Once, the two traveled all the way over to New Jersey, but the scent proved to be a false one. Bot grew thinner and older week by week, almost day by day. When the professor did not feel equal to going outdoors, Mrs. Bot went for him, and on these occasions often called at Flector's store to report progress, ask his advice and secure his encouragement. One day during one of these visits in the July following the loss of the violin, Flector handed Mrs. Bot a sheet of paper, saying, "I have written something down here. If you have that printed and put a reward to it, you will get your violin back." The wording, partly printed and partly written in script, ran as follows: "Violin lost. $500 reward. No questions asked for return of instrument taken from residence of Jean Bot. March 31, 1894, 355 West 31st Street. Absolute safety and secrecy guaranteed. Victor S. Flector, number 21 Union Square, violin maker and dealer." Mrs. Bot thanked him and took the notice away with her, but its publication had no result. The old professor began to fail. He no longer had an instrument upon which to teach his pupils, and those he could avail himself of seemed harsh and discordant. He had no appetite, and even found no solace in his pipe. Almost penniless, they were forced to give up their lodgings and move to Hoboken. Mrs. Bot still kept up the search, but the professor could no longer tramp the streets looking for his violin. He sat silent in his room, slowly, surely, dying of a broken heart. In course of time someone advised Mrs. Bot to lay her case before the district attorney, and accordingly, during the summer, she visited the criminal courts building and told her story to Colonel Allen, one of the assistants, who became greatly interested. The overwrought old woman had begun to suspect everybody, and even to accuse her husband's friend, Flector, of a lack of any real interest. She thought he ought to be able to find the violin if he really made the effort. Allen began to take notice. The sleuth in him pricked up its ears. Why, sure. Certainly, Flector was the one man who knew what Bot's violin was really worth, the one man who could sell it to advantage, and he had been done out of $500 by the old musician's stupidity. Allen thought he'd take a look into the thing. Now, there lived in the same boarding house with Allen a friend of his named Harry P. Durden, and to Durden Allen recounted the story of the lost violin and voiced his suspicions of Flector. Durden entered enthusiastically into the case, volunteering to play the part of an amateur detective. Accordingly Durden, accompanied by a central office man named Baird, visited Flector's place of business, and the two represented themselves as connoisseurs in violins and anxious to procure a genuine Strad for a certain Mr. Wright in St. Paul. Flector expressed entire confidence in his ability to procure one, and did almost succeed in purchasing for them the so-called Jupiter Strad. All this took time, and at last, on April 28, 1895, poor old Bot died in his boarding house in Hoboken. After the funeral the widow settled up her affairs, changing her boarding place temporarily, and, having no ties in this country, determined to return to end her days in the fatherland. On May 21 she wrote to Flechter, who had lost all track of her, that her husband had died, that she had moved to 306 River Street, Hoboken, and that she thought seriously of going back to Germany. 2 days later Flechter wrote the following letter to the Central Office man, who had given his name as Southan, an employee of the alleged Mr. Wright. Mr. Southan, care of H.P. Durden. Dear Sir, write to inform you that I have a genuine Strad to offer you and would like to see you at your earliest convenience. Very respectfully yours, Victor S. Flechter. When Alan saw this letter it seemed to him absolutely to confirm his suspicions. Now that the only person in the world who had been authoritatively able to identify the Duke of Cambridge Stradivarius was dead, Flechter was offering one for sale. Then occurred the strangest thing of all. On May 28, 5 days after Flechter's letter to Southan, Mrs. Bott received the following extraordinary epistle. Like the notice given her by Flechter in his office, it was partly written in printed capitals, and partly in script. May 28, 1895. To Mrs. Bott, 306 River Street, Hoboken, N.J. Dear Madam, I wish to inform you that the violin taken from your house some time ago will be returned if you are willing to abide by agreements that will be made between you and I later on. It was my intention first to dispose of it, but on account of its great value and the danger it would place me in by offering for sale, being a violin maker and dealer and not being able to sell with safety for such a large sum of money, I concluded to wait. I have now thought the matter over and come to the conclusion that a little money is better than none, and if you are anxious for the return of the violin and willing to pay a sum of money, small compared with the value of the violin, I think we can make a deal. You can put a personal in the New York Sun saying I am willing to give a sum of money for the return of the violin. No questions asked. Mrs. J. Bott. When I see your personal in the Sun I will let you know how the exchange can be made. Cave Dweller. This letter appeared to be written in a somewhat similar hand to that which penned the offer of the reward, which, according to Mrs. Bott, was Flechter's. By this time the widow and Alan were in close communication. The Cave Dweller letter, could it be shown to be in Flechter's penmanship, seemed to fix the crime on the violin dealer. Flechter's store is 2 flights up and looks out into Union Square. Before the window hangs a large gilded fiddle and the walls are decorated with pictures of famous musicians. In the rear is a safe where the more valuable instruments are kept. In the front sits Flechter himself, a stoutish man of middle height, with white hair and mustache. But on June 23, 1895, Flechter was out when Durden and Baird called, and only his clerk and office boy were on hand. Durden wished, he said, to see the genuine Strad, about which Mr. Flechter had written him. The boy went to the safe and brought back a violin in a red silk bag. Inside was inscribed, Antonius Stradivarius Cremonis fecit anno domini 1725. The figures 17 were printed and the 25 written in ink. Durden examined it for some 15 minutes and noted certain markings upon it. On June 26 they called again, found Flechter in and asked to see the violin. This time the dealer looked at himself from the safe, and, at their request, carried it to 22 Gramercy Park, where Durden said he desired some experts to pass upon its genuineness. On the way over Flechter guaranteed it to be a genuine Strad, and said it belonged to a retired merchant named Rossman, who would expect to get $4,000 for it. He himself would want $500, and Durden should have $500, so that they must not take less than $5,000. Once at Alan's boarding house, Flechter played upon the violin for Durden and the supposed Southan, and then the former asked to be allowed to take the instrument to a rear room and show it to a friend. Here Mrs. Bott, positively, identified the violin as that of her husband, clasping it to her bosom like a long-lost child. This was enough for Durden, who gave the instrument back to Flechter and caused his arrest as he was passing out of the front gate. The insulted dealer stormed and raged, but the car of Juggernaut had started upon its course, and that night Flechter was lodged in the city prison. Next morning he was brought before Magistrate Flammer in the Jefferson Market Police Court, and the violin was taken out of its case, which the police had sealed. At this, the first hearing in this extraordinary case, Mrs. Bott, of course, identified the violin positively as the Duke of Cambridge, and several other persons testified that, in substance, it was Bott's celebrated violin. But for the defendant, a number of violin makers swore that it was not the Bott violin at all, and more, that it was not even a Stradivarius. One of them, John J. Eller, to whom it will be necessary to revert later, made oath that the violin was his, stolen from him and brought to Flechter by the thief. On this testimony the magistrate naturally decided that the identity of the instrument had not been established and ordered that Flechter be discharged and the violin returned to him. Ordinarily that would have been the end of the case, but Allen had his own private views as to the guilt of the dealer, and on August 28 the grand jury filed an indictment against Flechter accusing him of feloniously receiving stolen property, the violin, knowing it to have been stolen. Great was Flechter's anger and chagrin, but he promptly gave bail and employed the ablest counsel he could afford. Now began the second act of this tragedy of errors. The case was called for trial, with the people's interests in the hands of James W. Osborne, just advancing into the limelight as a resourceful and relentless prosecutor. I say the people's case, but perhaps Allen's case would be a more fitting title. For the defense, Arthur W. Palmer held the fort, directing his fire upon Osborne and losing no advantage inadvertently given him. The noise of the conflict filled the courthouse and drowned the uproar on Broadway. Nightly and each morning the daily press gave columns to the proceedings. Every time the judge coughed the important fact was given due prominence, and every jibe of counsel carried behind it its insignia of recognition. Laughter. It was one of those first great battles in which the professional value of compressed air as an explosive force and small pica type as projectiles was demonstrated. It was a combat of wind and leaden endurance contest during which the jury slept fitfully for 3 long weeks. 2 things, the prosecution claimed, proved Flechter's guilt. First, the fact that the violin found in his possession was the Duke of Cambridge. Second, that the cave dweller letter was in the same handwriting as Flechter's notice of reward. Of course the latter proposition carried with it the necessity of proving in the first place that the notice itself was in Flechter's penmanship. Flechter, through his counsel, said it wasn't, and that he had never told Mrs. Bott that it was. He claimed that his brother-in-law, John D. Abraham, had written it. Mrs. Bott, he alleged, was an old lady and was mistaken in her testimony when she swore that he had said, "I have written down something." He had not said so. Mr. Abraham corroborated him. He had written it himself sitting in an armchair, all but the words 355 West 31st Street, which had been put in by a certain M.R. Jopling who had been present. Mr. Jopling swore that that was so, too. But, On cross-examination, it developed that Mr. Abraham had been practicing making copies of the notice at the suggestion of the lawyer for the defense, and, when Mr. Jopling took the stand, he was called upon to explain an affidavit made by him for Assistant District Attorney Allen, in which he affirmed that he did not know who wrote the words 355 West 31st Street. His explanation did not explain, and, anyhow, there did not seem to be any particular reason why Abraham and Jopling should have written Flechter's notice for him. Besides, even if Flechter did not write it and Abraham did, it would still remain almost as bad for Flechter if it was shown that cave dweller was his own brother-in-law. But Mrs. Bott was a woman who appealed strongly to a jury's sympathies, and she was clear that Flechter had said that he had written the notice. Moreover, she recalled that the date had first been written May and that Flechter had erased it and inserted March in its place. A microscopic examination revealed the fact that such an erasure had been made. When the smoke cleared, the credibility of the defense appeared badly damaged. But the precise point was of little importance. After all, the great question was the identity of cave dweller. On this point, a number of witnesses testified from a general knowledge of Flechter's handwriting that the cave dweller letter was his, and three well-known handwriting experts, Dr. Percy Fraser, Mr. Daniel T. Ames and Mr. David Carvalho, swore that, in their opinion, the same hand had written it that had penned the notice. It is not unlikely that Flechter's fear of a conviction led him to invite testimony in his behalf which would not bear the test of careful scrutiny. Many an innocent man has paid the penalty for uncommitted crime because he has sought to bolster up his defense with doubtful evidence without the incubus of which he would have been acquitted. Naturally, the chief point against Flechter, if it could be established, was his actual possession of the Bott Stradivarius when he was arrested. Upon this proposition, Mrs. Bott was absolutely positive beyond the possibility of error. So were 8 other witnesses for the prosecution. Then the defense produced a violin alleged to be the same one exhibited in the police court and brought by Flechter to Durden's house, and asked Mrs. Bott and her witnesses what they thought of it. Mrs. Bott could not identify it, but she swore no less positively that it was an entirely different violin from the one which she had seen before the magistrate. Then Osborne hurled his bomb over his enemy's parapet and cried loudly that a monstrous wicked fraud had been perpetrated to thwart justice, that the defense had faked another violin and were now trying to foist the bogus thing in evidence to deceive the court. 10 witnesses for the prosecution now swore that the violin so produced was not the one which Flechter had tried to sell Durden. Of course, it would have been comparatively easy to fake a violin, just as Osborne claimed, and the case shed some light upon the possibilities of the old violin industry. The star witness for the prosecution to prove that the instrument produced in the police court was the Bott violin was August M. Gamunder, and his testimony upon the trial before Recorder Goff is worthy of careful examination, since the jury considered it of great importance in reaching a verdict, even requesting that it should be reread to them some hours after retiring to deliberate. Gamunder testified, in substance, that he belonged to a family which had been making violins for 3 generations and had himself been making them for 20 years, that he was familiar with Bott's Stradivarius, having seen it 3 times, and that he firmly believed a large part of the violin produced before the magistrate was the missing Bott, certainly the back and scroll. Moreover, he was able to describe the markings of the Bott violin even to the label inside it. It should be mentioned, however, that in the magistrate's court he had been called only to describe the Bott violin and not to identify the one produced as the Bott itself. He further swore that the violin now offered by the defense on the trial was not the one in evidence before the magistrate, but was one which he had sold some years before to one Charles Palm. The defense, on the other hand, called among its witnesses John P. Frederick, a violin maker, who testified that he was familiar with the Bot's Strad and had seen it in 1873 at Bot's house, Grenescher Castle, in Germany, that he had repaired it in this country in 1885, that the instrument in court was not a Strad, nor even a good imitation of one, and, of course, was not the Duke of Cambridge, but that it was the identical instrument produced before the magistrate, and one which he recognized as having been sent him for repair by Charles Palm in 1885. Thus both sides agreed that the fiddle now offered in evidence was a bogus Strad, once belonging to a man named Palm, the only element of conflict being as to whether or not the violin which Flechter had offered for sale was the Palm instrument, or, in fact, Bot's famous Duke of Cambridge. All this technical testimony about violins and violin structure naturally bored the jury almost to extinction, and even the bitter personal encounters of counsel did not serve to relieve the dreariness of the trial. One oasis of humor in this desert of dry evidence gave them passing refreshment, when a picturesque witness for the defense, an instrument maker named Franz Bruckner, from South Germany, having been asked if the violin shown him was a Strad, replied, with a grunt of disgust, "Ach Himmel, nein." Being then invited to describe all the characteristics of genuine Stradivarius workmanship, he tore his hair and, with an expression of utter hopelessness upon his wrinkled face, exclaimed despairingly to the interpreter, "Doctor, if I gave you lessons in this every day for 3 weeks you would know no more than you do now." An answer which was probably true, and equally so of the jury, who were shouldered with the almost impossible task of determining from this mass of conflicting opinion just where the truth really lay. The chief witness for the defense was John J. Eller, who testified that he had been a musician for 30 years and a collector of violins, that the violin in court was the same one produced before the magistrate, and was not Bot's, but his own, that he had first seen it in the possession of Charles Palm in 1886 in his house in 8th Street and St. Mark's Place, New York City, had borrowed it from Palm and played on it for 2 months in Seabright, and had finally purchased it from Palm in 1891, and continued to play in concerts upon it, until, having been loaned by him to a music teacher named Perotti, in 23rd Street, it was stolen by the latter and sold to Flechter. It appeared that Eller had at once brought suit against Flechter for the possession of the instrument, which suit, he asserted, he was still pressing in the courts, and he now declared that the violin was in exactly the same condition in every respect as when produced in the police court, although it had been changed in some respects since it had been stolen. It had originally been made of baked wood by one Dedier Nicholas, an instrument maker of the first half of the 19th century, and stamped with the maker's name, but this inscription was now covered by a Stradivarius label. Eller scornfully pointed out that no Strad had ever been made of baked wood, and showed the jury certain pegs used by no other maker than Nicholas, and certain marks worn upon the instrument by his, the witness, own playing. He also exhibited the check with which he had paid for it. In support of this evidence, Charles Palm himself was called by the defense and identified the violin as one which he had bought some 12 years before for $15 or $20 and later sold to Eller. Upon the question of the identity of the instrument then lying before the jury, this evidence was conclusive, but, of course, it did not satisfy the jury as to whether Flechter had tried to sell the Palm violin or Bot's violin to Durden. Unfortunately, Eller's evidence threw aside light on the defense, without which the trial might well have resulted in an acquittal. Eller had sworn that he was still vigorously endeavoring to get the palm violin back from Flechter, as contradicting him in this respect, and as tending to show that the suit had not only been compromised but that he and Flechter were engaged in trying to put off the palm violin as a genuine Stradivarius and share the profit of the fraud. The prosecution introduced the following letter from the witness to his lawyer. Clifton House, Chicago, Illinois. March 23, 1896. Dear Counselor, received your letter just now. I have been expecting Mr. Flechter's lawyer would settle with you. He got $900 for the violin and Mr. Meyer arranged with myself for the half, $450, which he proposed himself, and have been expecting a settlement on their part long ago. I have assisted Mr. Palmer, his able lawyer, with the best of my ability, and have covered Mr. Flechter's shortcomings of faking the violin to Estrad. Yours most sincerely, John Eller. Metropolitan Opera Co., Chicago, Ill. From this letter it was fairly inferable that although the defendant might be innocent of the precise crime with which he was charged, he was, nevertheless, upon his own evidence, guilty of having faked a cheap Nicholas violin into a Strad, and of having offered it for sale for the exorbitant price of $5,000. This luckless piece of evidence undoubtedly influenced the jury to convict him. It will be recalled that 10 witnesses for the prosecution had sworn that the violin offered in evidence at the trial was not the one produced in the police court, as against the defendant's 5 who asserted that it was. The testimony was all highly technical and confusing, and the jury probably relied more upon their general impressions of the credibility of the witnesses than upon anything else. It is likely that most of the testimony, on both sides, in regard to the identity of the violin was honestly given, for the question was one upon which a genuine divergence of opinion was easily possible. Eller's letter from Chicago so affected the jury that they disregarded his testimony and reverted to that of August Gemunder, to whose evidence attention has already been called, and who swore that it was the Duke of Cambridge, which Flechter had tried to sell to Durden. Alas for the fallibility of even the most honest of witnesses. The case was ably argued by both sides, and every phase of this curious tangle of evidence given its due consideration. The defense very properly laid stress upon the fact that it would have been a ridiculous performance for Flechter to write the cave dweller letter and state therein that he was a violin dealer or maker, thus pointing, unmistakably, to himself, and to further state that for one in his position to dispose of it would be difficult and dangerous. The only explanation for the cave dweller letter which they could offer, however, was that some one interested in procuring Flechter's downfall had caused it to be sent for that purpose. This might either be a business rival or someone connected with the prosecution. While Palmer was summing up for the defense, he noticed Assistant District Attorney Allen smiling and dramatically turning upon him. He shouted, "This is no laughing matter, Colonel Allen. It is a very serious matter whether this man is to be allowed tonight to go home and kiss his little ones, or whether he is to be cast into jail because you used your brains to concoct a theory against him." Another consideration, which seemed deserving of weight, was that if Flechter did steal the Duke of Cambridge, it would have been a piece of incredible folly and carelessness upon his part to leave it in such an exposed place as the safe of his store, where it could be found by the police or shown by the officeboy to anyone who called. Yet the positive identification of August Gemunder and the fatal disclosures of Eller, coupled with the vehement insistence of the prosecution, led the jury to resolve what doubt they had in the case against the prisoner, and, after Deliberating 8 or 10 hours and being out all night, they returned a verdict of guilty. Flechter broke down and declared bitterly that he was the victim of a conspiracy upon the part of his enemies, assisted by a too credulous prosecuting attorney. Everybody admitted that it was an extraordinary case, but the press was consistent in its clamor against Flechter, and opinion generally was that he had been rightly convicted. On May 22 he was sentenced to the penitentiary for 12 months, but, after being incarcerated in the Tombs for 3 weeks, he secured a certificate of reasonable doubt and a stay until his conviction could be reviewed on appeal. Then he gave bail and was released. But he had been in jail. Flechter will never forget that. And, for the time being at least, his reputation was gone, his family disgraced, and his business ruined. A calm reading of the record of the trial suggests that the case abounded in doubts more or less reasonable, and that the court might well have taken it from the jury on that account. But a printed page of questions and answers carries with it no more than a suggestion of the value of testimony, the real significance of which lies in the manner in which it is given, the tone of the voice and the flash of the eye. Once again Flechter sat at his desk in the window behind the great gilded fiddle. To him, as to its owner, the great Stradivarius had brought only sorrow. But for him the world had no pity. Surely the strains of this wonderful instrument must have had a dying fall even when played by the loving hand of old Jean Bott. At last, after several years, in 1899, the case came up in the appellate division of the Supreme Court. Flechter had been led to believe that his conviction would undoubtedly be reversed and a new trial ordered, which would be tantamount to an acquittal, for it was hardly likely in such an event that a second trial would be considered advisable upon the same evidence. But to his great disappointment, his conviction was sustained by a divided court, in which only 2 of the 5 justices voted for a new trial. Again fortune had averted her face. If only one more judge had thought the evidence insufficient. The great gilded fiddle seemed to Flechter an omen of misfortune. Once more he gave bail, this time in $5,000, and was set at liberty pending his appeal to the highest court in the state. Once more he took his seat in his office and tried to carry on his business. But time had dragged on. People had forgotten all about Flechter and the lost Stradivarius, and when his conviction was affirmed little notice was taken of the fact. It was generally assumed that having been sentenced he was in jail. Then something happened which once more dragged Flechter into the limelight. Editors rushed to their files and dusted the cobwebs off the issues containing the accounts of the trial. The sign of the gilded fiddle became the daily center of a throng of excited musicians, lawyers, and reporters. The lost Stradivarius, the great Duke of Cambridge, the nemesis of Bott and of Flechter, was found by Flechter himself, as he claimed, on August 17, 1900. According to the dealer and his witnesses, the amazing discovery occurred in this wise. A violin maker named Joseph Farr, who at one time had worked for Flechter and had testified in his behalf at the trial, to the effect that the instrument produced in the police court was not Bott's Stradivarius, saw by chance a very fine violin in the possession of a family named Springer in Brooklyn, and notified Flechter of the fact. The latter, who was always ready to purchase choice violins, after vainly trying for a long time to induce the Springers to bring it to New York, called with Farr upon Mrs. Springer and asked to examine it. To his utter astonishment, she produced for his inspection Bott's long-lost Stradivarius. Hardly able to control his excitement, Flechter immediately returned to New York and reported the discovery to the police, who instantly began a thorough examination of the circumstances surrounding its discovery. The district attorney's office and the detective bureau were at first highly suspicious of this opportune discovery on the part of a convicted felon of the precise evidence necessary to clear him, but it was soon demonstrated to their pretty general satisfaction that the famous Stradivarius had in fact been pawned in the shop of one Benjamin Fox on the very day and within an hour of the theft, together with its case and two bows, for the insignificant sum of $4. After the legal period of redemption had expired, it had been put up at auction and bid in by the pawnbroker for a small advance over the sum for which it had been pawned. It lay exposed for purchase on Fox's shelf for some months, until, in December 1895, a tailor named James Dooley visited the shop to redeem a silver watch. Being, at the same time, in funds and able to satisfy his taste as a virtuoso, he felt the need of and bought a violin for $10, but, Fox urging upon him the desirability of getting a good one while he was about it, was finally persuaded to purchase the bought violin for $20 in its stead. Dooley took it home, played upon it as the spirit moved, and whenever in need of ready money brought it back to Fox as security, always redeeming it in time to prevent its sale. One day, being at Mrs. Springer's, where he was accustomed to purchase tailor trimmings, he offered it to her for sale, and, as her son was taking violin lessons, induced her to buy it for $30. And in the house of the Springers it had quietly remained ever since, while lawyers and prosecutors wrangled and thundered and witnesses swore positively to the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth, to prove that Flechter stole the violin and tried to sell it to Durden. On these facts, which did not seem to admit of contradiction, Recorder Goff ordered an oral examination of all the witnesses, the hearing of which, sandwiched in between the current trials in his court, dragged along for months, but which finally resulted in establishing to the court's satisfaction that the violin discovered in the possession of the Springers was the genuine Duke of Cambridge, and that it could not have been in Flechter's possession at the time he was arrested. On July 7, 1902, 8 years after Bott's death and the arrest and indictment of Flechter for the theft of the violin, a picturesque group assembled in the General Sessions. There was Flechter and his lawyer, Mrs. Springer, and her son, the attorneys for the prosecution, and lastly old Mrs. Bott. The seals of the case were broken and the violin identified by the widow as that of her husband. The Springers waived all claim to the violin, and the court dismissed the indictment against the defendant and ordered the Stradivarius to be delivered to Mrs. Bott. With these words, "Mrs. Bott, it affords very great pleasure to the court to give the violin to you. You have suffered many years of sorrow and trouble in regard to it." 8 years, sighed the old lady, clasping the violin in her arms. "I wish you a great deal of pleasure in its possession," continued the recorder. Thus ended, as a matter of record, the case of the people against Flechter. For 8 years the violin dealer and his family had endured the agony of disgrace. He had spent a fortune in his defense, and had nevertheless been convicted of a crime of which he was at last proved innocent. Yet, there are those who, when the case is mentioned, shake their heads wisely, as if to say that the whole story of the lost Stradivarius has never been told. Story 11. The Last of the Wiretappers. "Sir," replied the knave unabashed, "I am one of those who do make a living by their wits." John Felix, a dealer in automatic musical instruments in New York City, was swindled out of $50,000 on February 2, 1905, by what is commonly known as the wiretapping game. During the previous August, a man calling himself by the name of Nelson had hired room 46, in a building at 27 East 22nd Street, as a school for wireless telegraphy. Later on he had installed over a dozen deal tables, each fitted with a complete set of ordinary telegraph instruments and connected with wires which, while apparently passing out of the windows, in reality plunged behind a desk into a small dry battery. Each table was fitted with a shaded electric drop light, and the room was furnished with the ordinary paraphernalia of a telegraph office. The janitor never observed any activity in the school. There seemed to be no pupils, and no one haunted the place except a short, ill-favored person who appeared monthly and paid the rent. On the afternoon of February 1, 1905, Mr. Felix was called to the telephone of his store and asked to make an appointment later in the afternoon, with a gentleman named Nelson who desired to submit to him a business proposition. 15 minutes afterward Mr. Nelson arrived in person and introduced himself as having met Felix at Lou Ludlam's gambling house. He then produced a copy of the evening telegram which contained an article to the effect that the Western Union Telegraph Company was about to resume its pool room service, that is to say, to supply the pool rooms with the telegraphic returns of the various horse races being run in different parts of the United States. The paper also contained, in connection with this item of news, a photograph which might, by a stretch of the imagination, have been taken to resemble Nelson himself. Mr. Felix, who was a German gentleman of French sympathies, married to an American lady, had recently returned to America after a 10 years sojourn in Europe. He had had an extensive commercial career, was possessed of a considerable fortune, and had at length determined to settle in New York, where he could invest his money to advantage and at the same time conduct a conservative and harmonious business in musical instruments. Like the Teutons of old, dwelling among the forests of the Elbe, Mr. Felix knew the fascination of games of chance, and he had heard the merry song of the will at both Hamburg and Monte Carlo. In Europe the pleasures of the gaming table had been comparatively inexpensive, but in New York for some unknown reason the fickle goddess had not favored him and he had lost upward of $51,000. Zeu Veal, as he himself expressed it. Being of a philosophic disposition, however, he had pocketed his losses and contented himself with the consoling thought that, whereas he might have lost all, he had in fact lost only a part. It might well have been that had not the tempter appeared in the person of his afternoon visitor, he would have remained in status quo for the rest of his natural life. In the sunny window of his musical store, surrounded by zitherns, auto harps, dulcimers, psalteries, sackbuts, and other instruments of melody, the advent of Nelson produced the effect of a sudden and unexpected discord. Felix distrusted him from the very first. The proposition was simplicity itself. It appeared that Mr. Nelson was in the employ of the Western Union Telegraph Company, which had just opened a branch office for racing news at 27 East 22nd Street. This branch was under the superintendence of an old associate and intimate friend of Nelson's by the name of McPherson. Assuming that they could find someone with the requisite amount of cash, they could all make their everlasting fortunes by simply having McPherson withhold the news of some race from the pool rooms long enough to allow one of the others to place a large bet upon some horse, which had in fact already won and was resting comfortably in the stable. Felix grasped the idea instantly. At the same time he had his suspicions of his visitor. It seemed peculiar that he, an inconspicuous citizen who had already lost $50,000 in gambling houses, should be selected as the recipient of such a momentous opportunity. Moreover, he knew very well that gentlemen in gambling houses were never introduced at all. He thought he detected the odor of a rodent. He naively inquired why, if all these things were so, Nelson and his friend were not already yet millionaires 2 or 3 times? The answer was at once forthcoming. That they had been, but also had been robbed, unmercifully robbed, by one in whom they had had confidence and to whom they had entrusted their money. And now we are poor, penniless clerks, sighed Nelson, and if we should offer to make a big bet ourselves, the gamblers would be suspicious and probably refuse to place it. I think this looks like a swindling game, said Felix shrewdly. So it did, so it was. By and by Felix put on his hat and, escorted by Nelson, paid a visit to the branch office at 27 East 22nd Street, where once solitude had reigned supreme and the spider had spun his web amid the fast-gathering dust. All was now tumultuous activity. 15 busy operators in eye shades and shirt sleeves took the news hot from the humming wires and clicked it off to the waiting pool rooms. Scarecrow wins by a neck, cried one, Blackbird second. Make the odds 5-3, shouted a short, ill-favored man, who sat at a desk, puffing a large black cigar. The place buzzed like a beehive and ticked like a clockmaker's. It had an atmosphere of breathless excitement all its own. Felix watched and marveled, wondering if dreams came true. The short, ill-favored man strolled over and condescended to make Mr. Felix's acquaintance. An hour later the 3 of them were closeted among the zitherns. At the same moment the 15 operators were ranged in a line in front of a neighboring bar, their elbows simultaneously elevated at an angle of 45 degrees. Felix still had lingering doubts. Hadn't Mr. McPherson some little paper, a letter, a bill, a receipt, or a check, to show that he was really in the employ of the Western Union? No, said Mac, but he had something better, the badge which he had received as the fastest operator among the company's employees. Felix wanted to see it, but Mac explained that it was locked up in the vault at the Farmers Loan and Trust Co. To Felix this had a safe sound, Farmers Trust Co. Then matters began to move rapidly. It was arranged that Felix should go down in the morning and get $50,000 from his bankers, Seligman and Meyer. After that he was to meet Nelson at the store and go with him to the pool room, where the big financiers played their money. McPherson was to remain at the office and telephone them the results of the races in advance. By nightfall they would be worth $500,000. I hope you have a good large safe, remarked Nelson, tentatively. The 3 conspirators parted with mutual expressions of confidence and esteem. Next morning Mr. Felix went to his bankers and procured $50,000 in 5 house and dollar bills. The day passed very slowly. There was not even a flurry in zitherns. He waited impatiently for Nelson, who was to come at 5 o'clock. At last Nelson arrived and they hurried to the Fifth Avenue Hotel where the coup was to take place. And now another marvel. Wasserman Brothers stockbrokering office, which closes at 3, hummed just as the office had done the evening before, and with the very same bees, although Felix did not recognize them. It was crowded with men who struggled violently with one another in their eagerness to force their bets into the hands of a benevolent-looking person, who, Felix was informed, was the trusted cashier of the establishment. And the sums were so large that even Felix gasped. "Make that $40,000 on cocoa," cried a bald-headed capper. "Mr. Gates wants to double his bet on Jack Stone. Make it $80,000,000, shrieked another. "Gentlemen, gentlemen," begged the trusted cashier, "not quite so fast, if you please. One at a time. 60,000 on Hesper for a place," bawled one addressed as Mr. Keene. While Messrs. Ryan, Whitney, Belmont, Sullivan, McCarran, and Murphy all made handsome wagers. From time to time a sporty-looking man standing beside a ticker shouted the odds and read off the returns. Felix heard with straining ears. They're off. Baby leads at the quarter. Susan is gaining. They're on the stretch. Satan wins by a nose. Peter second. There was a deafening uproar, hats were tossed ceilingward, and great wads of money were passed out by the trusted cashier to indifferent millionaires. Felix wanted to rush in and bet at once on something. If he waited it might be too late. Was it necessary to be introduced to the cashier? No. Would he take the bet? All right, but at that moment a page elbowed his way among the money, calling plaintively for Felix. Mr. Felix. Shrinking at the thought of such publicity in such distinguished company, Felix caught the boy's arm and learned that he was wanted at the telephone booth in the hotel. It must be Mac, said Nelson. Now don't make any mistake. Felix promised to use the utmost care. It was Mac. Is this Mr. Felix? Yes. Well, be very careful now. I am going to give you the result of the third race, which has already been run. I will hold back the news. 3 minutes. This is merely to see if everything is working right. Don't make any bet. If I give you the winners correctly, you can put your money on the fourth race. The horse that won the last is Col. Starbottle Don Juan is second. Now just step back and see if I am right. Felix rushed back to the pool room. As he entered, the man at the tape was calling out that they were off. In due course they reached the quarter and then the half. A terrific struggle was in progress between Col. Starbottle and Don Juan. First one was ahead and then the other. Finally they came thundering down to the stretch, Col. Starbottle winning by a neck. Gates won $90,000, and several others pocketed wads running anywhere from $20,000 to $60,000. Felix hurried back to the telephone. Mac was at the other end. Now write this down, admonished McPherson, we can't afford to have any mistake. Old Stone has just won the fourth race, with Calvert second. Play Old Stone to win at 5-1. We shall make $250,000 and Old Stone is safe in the stable all the time and his jockey is smoking a cigarette on the clubhouse veranda. Good luck, old man. Felix had some difficulty in getting near the trusted cashier, so many financiers were betting on Calvert. Felix smiled to himself. He'd show them a thing or two. Finally he managed to push his envelope containing the $5 $10,000 bills into the trusted cashier's hand. The latter marked it Old Stone, 5-1 to win, and thrust it into his pocket. Then Whitney or somebody bet $70,000 on Calvert. They're off, shouted the man at the tape. How he lived while they tore around the course Felix never knew. Neck and neck Old Stone and Calvert passed the quarter, the half, and the three-quarter post, and with the crowd yelling like demons came hurtling down the stretch. Old Stone wins, cried the booster at the tape in a voice husky with excitement. Calvert a close second. Felix nearly fainted. His head swam. He had won $250,000. Then the voice of the booster made itself audible above the confusion. What? A mistake? Not possible, yes. Owing to some confusion at the finish. Both jockeys wearing the same colors, the official returns now read Calvert first. Old Stone second. Among the zitherns Felix sat and wondered if he had been swindled. He had not returned to Wasserman Brothers. Had he done so he would have found it empty 5 minutes after he had lost his money. The millionaires were already streaming hilariously into Sharky's. Gates pledged Belmont and Keene pledged Whitney. Each had earned $5 by the sweat of his brow. The glorious army of wiretappers had won another victory, and their generals had consummated a campaign of months. Expenses, roughly, $600. Receipts, $50,000. Net profits, $48,400. Share of each, $16,133. A day or two later Felix wandered down to police headquarters, and in the rogues gallery identified the photograph of Nelson, whom he then discovered to be none other than William Crane, alias John Lawson, alias John Larson, a well-known wiretapper, arrested some dozen times within a year or two for similar offenses. McPherson turned out to be Christopher Tracy, alias Charles J. Tracy, alias Charles Tompkins, alias Topping, alias Toppin, etc., etc., arrested some 8 or 10 times for wiretapping. The trusted cashier materialized in the form of one Wyatt, alias Fred Williams, etc., a wiretapper and pal of Chappie Moran and Larry Summerfield. Detective Sergeants Fogarty and Mundy were at once detailed upon the case and arrested within a short time both Nelson and McPherson. The trusted cashier who had pocketed Felix's $50,000 has never been caught. It is said that he is running a first-class hostelry in a western city. But that is another story. When Acting Inspector O'Brien ordered McPherson brought into his private room, the latter unhesitatingly admitted that the three of them had trimmed Felix of his $50,000, exactly as the latter had alleged. He stated that Wyatt, alias Williams, was the one who had taken in the money, that it was still in his possession, and still intact in its original form. He denied, however, any knowledge of Wyatt's whereabouts. The reason for this indifference became apparent when the two prisoners were arraigned in the magistrate's court, and their counsel demanded their instant discharge on the ground that they had committed no crime for which they could be prosecuted. He cited an old New York case, McCord v.S. The People, to which seemed in a general way to sustain his contention, and which had been followed by another and much more recent decision, The People v.S. Livingston. 3. The first of these cases had gone to the Court of Appeals, and the general doctrine had been enunciated that where a person parts with his money for an unlawful or dishonest purpose, even though he is tricked into so doing by false pretenses, a prosecution for the crime of larceny cannot be maintained. 246 New York 470. 347 App. Div 283. In the McCord case, the defendant had falsely pretended to the complainant, a man named Miller, that he was a police officer and held a warrant for his arrest. By these means he had induced Miller to give him a gold watch and a diamond ring as the price of his liberty. The conviction in this case was reversed on the ground that Miller parted with his property for an unlawful purpose, but there was a very strong dissenting opinion from Mr. Justice Peckham, now a member of the bench of the Supreme Court of the United States. In the second case, that of Livingston, the complainant had been defrauded out of $500 by means of the green goods game, but this conviction was reversed by the Appellate Division of the Second Department on the authority of the McCord case. The opinion in this case was written by Mr. Justice Cullen, now Chief Judge of the New York Court of Appeals, who says in conclusion, "We very much regret being compelled to reverse this conviction. Even if the prosecutor intended to deal in counterfeit money, that is no reason why the appellant should go unwhipped of justice. We venture to suggest that it might be Well for the legislature to alter the rule laid down in McCord vs. People. Well might the judges regret being compelled to set a rogue at liberty simply because he had been ingenious enough to invent a fraud, very likely with the assistance of a shyster lawyer, which involved the additional turpitude of seducing another into a criminal conspiracy. Livingston was turned loose upon the community in spite of the fact that he had swindled a man out of $500, because he had incidentally led the latter to believe that in return he was to receive counterfeit money or green goods, which might be put into circulation. Yet, because some years before, the judges of the Court of Appeals had, in the McCord matter, adopted the rule followed in civil cases, to wit that as the complaining witness was himself in fault and did not come into court with clean hands, he could have no standing before them, the appellate division in the next case felt obliged to follow them and to rule tantamount to saying that two wrongs could make a right and two knaves one honest man. It may seem a trifle unfair to put it in just this way, but when one realizes the iniquity of such a doctrine as applied to criminal cases, it is hard to speak softly. Thus the broad and general doctrine seemed to be established that so long as a thief could induce his victim to believe that it was to his advantage to enter into a dishonest transaction, he might defraud him to any extent in his power. Immediately there sprang into being hordes of swindlers, who, aided by adroit shyster lawyers, invented all sorts of schemes which involved some sort of dishonesty upon the part of the person to be defrauded. The wire-tappers, of whom Larry Summerfield was the Napoleon, the gold brick and green goods man, and the sick engineers flocked to New York, which, under the unwitting protection of the Court of Appeals, became a veritable Mecca for persons of their ilk. To readers unfamiliar with the cast of mind of professional criminals it will be almost impossible to appreciate with what bold insouciance these vultures now hovered over the metropolitan barnyard. Had not the Court of Appeals itself recognized their profession? They had nothing to fear. The law was on their side. They walked the streets flaunting their immunity in the very face of the police. Wiretapping became an industry, a legalized industry with which the authorities might interfere at their peril. Indeed, there is one instance in which a wiretapper successfully prosecuted his victim, after he had trimmed him, upon a charge of grand larceny arising out of the same transaction. One crook bred another every time he made a victim, and the disease of crime, the most infectious of all distempers, ate its way unchecked into the body politic. Broadway was thronged by a prosperous gentry, the aristocracy and elite of knavery, who dressed resplendently, flourished like the green bay tree, and spent their, or rather their victims, money with the lavish hand of one of Dumas's gentlemen. But the evil did not stop there. Seeing that their brothers prospered in New York, and neither being learned in the law nor gifted with the power of nice discrimination between rogueries, all the other knaves in the country took it for granted that they had at last found the Elysian fields and came trooping here by hundreds to ply their various trades. The McCord case stood out like a cabalistic sign upon a gatepost telling all the rascals who passed that way that the city was full of honest folk waiting to be turned into rogues and trimmed. And presently we did pass a narrow lane, and at the mouth espied a written stone, telling beggars by a word like a wee pitchfork to go that way. The tip went abroad that the city was good graft for everybody, and in the train of the wire-tappers thronged the flim-flammer, confidence man, booster, capper and every sort of affiliated crook, recalling Charles Reade's account in The Cloister and the Hearth of Gerard in Lorraine among their kin of another period. With them and all they had, 'twas lightly come and lightly go, and when we left them my master said to me, "This is thy first lesson, but tonight we shall be at Hansburg. Come with me to the rot boss there, and I'll show thee all our folk. And their lays, and especially the Losnas, the Dutzers, the Schleppers, the Gickisses, the Schwanfelders, whom in England we call shivering jemmies, the Suntrigers, the Schweigers, the Joners, the Cecildeggers, the Genskirers, in France Marcandiers the Varanarans, the Stabulars. With a few foreigners like ourselves, such as Pieters, Frank Maidu, Polis Sons, Malingruas, Traders, Rufflers, Whipjacks, Domerars, Glimmerars, Jarkmen, Patricos, Swatters, Autumn Morts, Walking Morts, Inel. Cried I. Stopping him, art as gleesome as the evil one accounting of his imps. I'll jot down in my tablet all these caitiffs and their accursed names, for knowledge is knowledge. But go among them alive or dead, that will I not with my good will. And a large part of it was due simply to the fact that 7 learned men upon 7 comfortable chairs in the city of Albany had said, many years ago, that neither the law or public policy designs the protection of rogues in their dealings with each other, or to ensure fair dealing and truthfulness as between each other, in their dishonest practices. The reason that the wiretapping game was supposed to come within the scope of the McCord case was this: it deluded the victim into the belief that he was going to cheat the pool room by placing a bet upon a sure thing. Secondarily, it involved, as the dupe supposed, the theft or disclosure of messages which were being transmitted over the lines of a telegraph company, a misdemeanor. Hence, it was argued, the victim was as much a thief as the proposer of the scheme, had parted with his money for a dishonest purpose, did not come into court with clean hands, and no prosecution could be sustained, no matter whether he had been led to give up his money by means of false pretenses or not. While wiretapping differed technically from the precise frauds committed by McCord and Livingston, it nevertheless closely resembled those swindlers in general character and came clearly within the doctrine that the law was not designed to protect rogues in their dealings with each other. No genuine attempt had ever been made to prosecute one of these gentry until the catastrophe which deprived Felix of his $50,000. The wiretappers rolled in money. Indeed, the fraternity were so liberal with their rolls that they became friendly with certain police officials and intimately affiliated with various politicians of influence, a friend of one of whom went on Summerfield's bond when the latter was being prosecuted for the sick engineer frauds to the extent of $30,000. They regularly went to Europe in the summer season and could be seen at all the race courses and gambling resorts of the continent. It is amusing to chronicle in this connection that just prior to Macpherson's arrest, that is to say during the summer vacation of 1904, he crossed the Atlantic on the same steamer with an assistant district attorney of New York County, who failed to recognize his ship companion and found him an entertaining and agreeable comrade. The trial came on before Judge Warren W. Foster in Part 3 of the General Sessions on February 27, 1906. A special panel quickly supplied a jury, which, after hearing the evidence, returned in short order a verdict of guilty. As Judge Foster believed the McCord case to be still the law of the state, he, of his own motion, and with commendable independence, immediately arrested judgment. The people thereupon appealed, the Court of Appeals sustained Judge Foster, and the defendant was discharged. It is, however, satisfactory to record that the legislature at its next session amended the penal code in such a way as to entirely deprive the wiretappers and their kind of the erstwhile protection which they had enjoyed under the law. Story 12. When Robert A. Ammon, a member of the New York Bar, was convicted, after a long trial, on the 17th of June, 1903, of receiving stolen goods, he had, in the parlance of his class, been due for a long time. The stolen property in question was the sum of $30,500 in greenbacks, part of the loot of the notorious Franklin Syndicate, devised and engineered by William F. Miller, who later became the catspaw of his legal advisor, the subject of this history. Ammon stood at the bar and listened complacently to his sentence of not less than 4 years at hard labor in Sing Sing. A sneer curved his lips as, after nodding curtly to his lawyer, he turned to be led away by the court attendant. The fortune snatched from his client had procured for him the most adroit of counsel, the most exhaustive of trials. He knew that nothing had been left undone to enable him to evade the consequences of his crime, and he was cynically content. For years Bob Ammon had been a familiar figure in the Wall Street district of New York. Although the legal advisor of swindlers and confidence men, he was a type of American whose energies, if turned in a less dubious direction, might well have brought him honorable distinction. Tall, strong as a bull, bluff, good-natured, reckless and of iron nerve, he would have given good account of himself as an Indian fighter or frontiersman. His fine presence, his great vitality, his coarse humor, his confidence and bravado, had won for him many friends of a certain kind and engendered a feeling among the public that somehow, although the associate and advisor of criminals, he was outside the law, to the circumventing of which his energies were directed. Unfortunately his experiences with the law had bred in him a contempt for it which ultimately caused his downfall. "The reporters aren't bothering you, are they?" he had said to Miller in his office. "Hang them. Send them to me. I'll talk to them." And talk to them he did. He could talk a police inspector or a city magistrate into a state of vacuous credulity, and needless to say he was to his clients as a god. Knowing both good and evil, as well as how to eschew the one and avoid the other. Miller hated, loathed, and feared him, yet freely entrusted his liberty, and all he had risked his liberty to gain, to this strange and powerful personality, which held him enthralled by the mere exercise of a physical superiority. The Franklin Syndicate had collapsed amid the astonished outcries of its thousands of victims, on November 24, 1899, when, under the advice and with the assistance of Ammon, its organizer, 520 percenter Miller, had fled to Canada. It was nearly 4 years later, in June 1903, that Ammon, arraigned at the bar of justice as a criminal, heard Assistant District Attorney not call William F. Miller, convict, to the stand to testify against him. A curious contrast they presented as they faced one another, the emaciated youth of 25, the hand of death already tightly fastened upon his meager frame, coughing, hollow-cheeked, insignificant, flat-nosed, almost repulsive, who dragged himself to the witness chair, and the swaggering athlete who glared at him from the bar, surrounded by his cordon of able counsel. As Ammon fixed his penetrating gaze upon his former client, Miller turned pale and dropped his eyes. Then the prosecutor, realizing the danger of letting the old hypnotic power return, even for an instant, quickly stepped between them. Miller raised his eyes and smiled, and those who heard knew that this miserable creature had been through the fire and come forth to speak true things. The trial of Ammon involved practically the reproving of the case against Miller, for which the latter had been convicted and sentenced to 10 years in state's prison, whence he now issued like one from the tomb to point the skeleton incriminating finger at his betrayer. But the case began by the convict witness testifying that the whole business was a miserable fraud from start to finish, carried on and guided by the advice of the defendant. He told how he, a mere boy of 21, burdened with a sick wife and baby, unfit by training or ability for any sort of lucrative employment, a hanger-on of bucket shops and, in his palmiest days, a speculator in tiny lots of feebly margined stocks, finding himself without means of support, conceived the alluring idea of soliciting funds for investment, promising enormous interest, and paying this interest out of the principal instead to him. For a time he preyed only upon his friends, claiming inside information of large deals and paying 10% per week on the money received out of his latest deposits. Surely the history of civilization is a history of credulity. Miller prospered. His earlier friend customers who had hesitatingly taken his receipt for $10, and thereafter had received $1 every Monday morning, repeated the operation and returned in ever-increasing numbers. From having his office in his hat, he took an upper room in a small two-story house at 144 Floyd Street, Brooklyn, an humble tenement, destined to be the scene of one of the most extraordinary exhibitions of man's cupidity and foolishness in modern times. At first he had tramped round, like a peddler, delivering the dividends himself and soliciting more, but soon he hired a boy. This was in February, 1899. Business increased. The golden flood began to appear in an attenuated but constant rivulet. He hired 4 more employees and the whole top floor of the house. The golden rivulet became a steady stream. From a penhandler he rolled in ready thousands. The future opened into magnificent auriferous distances. He began to call himself the Franklin Syndicate, and to advertise that the way to wealth is as plain as the road to the market. He copied the real brokers and scattered circulars and weekly letters over the country, exciting the rural mind in distant Manitoba and Louisiana. There was an instantaneous response. His mail required the exclusive attention of several clerks. The stream of gold became a rushing torrent. Every Monday morning the Floyd Street house was crowded with depositors who drew their interest, added to it, deposited it again, and went upon their way rejoicing. Nobody was going to have to work any more. The out-of-town customers received checks for their interest drawn upon the Franklin Syndicate, together with printed receipts for their deposits, all signed William F. Miller, by means of a rubber stamp. No human hand could have signed them all without writer's cramp. The rubber stamp was Miller's official signature. Then with a mighty roar, the torrent burst into a deluge. The Floyd Street quarters were besieged by a clamoring multitude fighting to see which of them could give up his money first. And there had to be a special delivery for Miller's mail. He rented the whole house and hired 50 clerks. You could deposit your money almost anywhere. From the parlor to the pantry, the clothes closet or the bathroom. Fridays the public stormed the house en masse, since the money must be deposited on that day to draw interest for the following week. The crush was so enormous that the stoop broke down. Imagine it. In quiet Brooklyn, people struggling to get up the steps to cram their money into Miller's pockets. There he sat, behind a desk, at the top of the stoop, solemnly taking the money thrown down before him and handing out little pink and green stamped receipts in exchange. There was no place to put the money, so it was shoved onto the floor behind him. Friday afternoons Miller and his clerks waded through it, knee-high. There was no pretense of bookkeeping. Simply in self-defense Miller issued in October a pronunciamento that he could not, in justice to his business, consent to receive less than $50 at one time. Theoretically, there was no reason why the thing should not have gone on practically forever. Miller and everybody else becoming richer and richer. So long as the golden stream swelled 5 times each year, everybody would be happy. How could anybody fail to be happy who saw so much money lying around loose everywhere? One of Miller's Franklin Syndicate receipts. One of Miller's Franklin Syndicate receipts. But the business had increased to such an extent that Miller began to distrust his own capacity to handle it. He therefore secured a partner in the person of one Edward Schlesinger, and with him went to Charlestown, Massachusetts, for the purpose of opening another office, in charge of which they placed a man named Lewis Powers. History repeated itself. Powers shipped the deposits to Miller every day or two by express. Was there ever such a plethora of easy money? But Schlesinger was no Miller. He decided that he must have a third of the profits, heaven knows how they computed them, and have them, moreover, each day in cash. Hence there was a daily accounting, part of the receipts being laid aside to pay off interest checks and interest, and the balance divided. Schlesinger carried his off in a bag, Miller took the rest, cash, money orders and checks, and deposited it in a real bank. How the money poured in may be realized from the fact that the excess of receipts over disbursements for the month ending November 16 was $430,000. Hitherto Miller had been the central figure. Col. Robert A. Ammon now became the deus ex machina. Miller's advertising had become so extensive that he had been forced to retain a professional agent, one Rudolf Gunter, to supervise it. And when the newspapers began to make unpleasant comments, Gunter took Miller to Ammon's office in the Bennett Building in Nassau Street. Ammon accepted $100 from Miller, listened to his account of the business, and examined copies of the circulars. When he was handed one of the printed receipts, he said they were incriminating. Miller must try to get them back. He advised, as many another learned counselor has done, incorporating the business, since by this means stock could be sold and exchanged for the incriminating receipts. He explained the mistakes of the Dean crowd, but showed how he had been able to safeguard them in spite of the fact that they had foolishly insisted on holding the stock in their company themselves instead of making their customers the stockholders. Nevertheless, you do not see any of the Dean people in jail, boasted Ammon. From now on Miller and he were in frequent consultation, and Ammon took steps to incorporate, procuring for that purpose from Wells, Fargo & Co. a certificate of deposit for $100,000. Occasionally he would visit Floyd Street to see how things were going. Miller became a mere puppet. Ammon twitched the wire. It was now well on in November, and the press of both Boston and New York was filled with scathing attacks upon the syndicate. The reporters became so inquisitive as to be annoying to the peaceful Miller. "Send the reporters over to me," directed Ammon. The Post, of Boston, said the whole thing was a miserable swindle. Ammon, accompanied by Miller, carrying a satchel which contained $50,000 in greenbacks, went to Boston, visited the offices of the Post, and pitched into the editor. "The business is all right, you must give us a fair deal." The pair also visited Watts, the chief of police. "You keep your mouth shut," said Ammon to Miller. "I'll do all the talking." He showed Watts the bag of money, and demanded what he had meant by calling the enterprise a green goods business. If the thing wasn't all right, did Watts suppose that he, Col. Robert A. Ammon, would be connected with it? The chief backed down, and explained that he had jokingly referred to the color of one of the receipts which happened to be green. In spite of Ammon's confidence, however, there was an uneasy feeling in the air. and it was decided to put an advertisement in the post offering to allow any customer who so desired to withdraw his deposit, without notice, upon the following Saturday. This announcement did not have precisely the anticipated effect, and Saturday saw a large crowd of victims eager to withdraw their money from the Boston office of the Franklin Syndicate. Powers paid the Pauls, of Boston, out of the bag brought on by Miller containing the deposits of the Peters, of Brooklyn. Meantime, Ammon addressed the throng, incidentally blackguarding a Post reporter before the crowd, telling them that his paper was a yellow paper, had never amounted to anything, and never would. Some timid souls took courage and redeposited their money. The run continued one day and cost Ammon and Miller about $28,000. Ammon took $5,000 cash as a fee out of the bag, and the pair returned to New York. But confidence had been temporarily restored. The beginning of the end, however, was now in sight, at least for the keen vision of Bob Ammon. He advised stimulating deposits and laying hands on all the money possible before the crash came. Accordingly, Miller sent a telegram. Collect, to all depositors. We have inside information of a big transaction, to begin Saturday or Monday morning. Big profits. Remit at once so as to receive the profits. William F. Miller. Franklin Syndicate. 1,000 or so were returned, the depositors having refused to pay the charges. The rest of the customers in large measure responded. But the game was nearly up. There were scareheads in the papers. Miller saw detectives on every corner. And, like a rat leaving a sinking ship, Schlesinger scuttled away for the last time. With a bag of money on the evening of Tuesday, November 21, 1899. The rest of the deposits were crammed into Miller's desk and left there overnight. The next morning Miller returned to Floyd Street and spent that day in the usual routine, and also on Thursday remained until about 12 o'clock noon, when he placed $30,500 in bills in a satchel and started for Ammon's office, where he found Schlesinger likewise with a satchel. "The jig's up," announced Schlesinger. "Billy, I think you'll have to make a run for it," said Ammon. "The best thing for you is to go to Canada." It still remained to secure the money, which Miller had deposited in the banks, in such a way that the customers could not get hold of it. Ammon explained how that could easily be done. The money should be all turned over to him, and none of the creditors would ever see it again. He did not deem it necessary to suggest that neither would Miller. Accordingly the two, the lawyer and the client, went to the office of Wells, Fargo & Co., Ammon obligingly carrying the satchel containing the $30,500. Here Ammon deposited the contents to his own account, as well as the certificate of deposit for $100,000 previously mentioned, and a check for $10,000, representing the balance of Miller's loot. In addition to this, he received an order for $40,000 United States government bonds, which were on deposit with Wells, Fargo & Co., and later, through Miller's father, $65,000 in bonds of the New York Central Railroad and the United States government. Thus Ammon secured from his dupe the sum of $245,500, the actual market value of the securities bringing the amount up to $250,500, besides whatever sums he had been paid by Miller for legal services, which could not have been less than $10,000 or $15,000. The character of the gentleman is well illustrated by the fact that later, when paying Mrs. Miller her miserable pittance of $5 per week, he explained to her that he was giving her that out of his own money, and that her husband owed him Ammon's deposit slips and a receipt signed by Mrs. Ammon. Ammon's deposit slips and a receipt signed by Mrs. Ammon. There still remained, however, the chance of getting a few dollars more, and Ammon advised Miller to try to get Friday's receipts, which were the heaviest day's business. Acting on this suggestion, Miller returned to Floyd Street the next morning at about 9:30, finding a great crowd of people waiting outside. About 1 o'clock he started to go home, but discovering that he was being followed by a man whom he took to be a detective, he boarded a streetcar, dodged through a drugstore and a Chinese laundry, finally made the elevated railroad, with his pursuer at his heels, and eventually reached the lawyer's office. About 2 o'clock in the afternoon, word was received almost immediately over the telephone that Miller had been indicted in Kings County for conspiracy to defraud, and Ammon stated that the one thing for Miller to do was to go away. Miller replied that he did not want to go unless he could take his wife and baby with him, but Ammon assured him that he would send them to Canada later in charge of his own wife. Under this promise Miller agreed to go, and Ammon procured a man named Enright to take Miller to Canada, saying that he was an ex-detective and could get him out of the way. Ammon further promised to forward to Miller whatever money he might need to retain lawyers for him in Montreal. Thereupon Miller exchanged hats with someone in Ammon's office and started for Canada in the custody of the lawyer's representative. How the wily colonel must have chuckled as poor Miller trotted down the stairs like a sheep leaving his fleece behind him. A golden fleece indeed. Did ever a lawyer have such a piece of luck? Here was a little fellow who had invented a brilliant scheme to get away with other people's money and had carried it through successfully, more than successfully, beyond the dreams of even the most avaricious criminal, and then, richer than Midas, had handed over the whole jolly fortune to another for the other's asking, without even taking a scrap of paper to show for it. More than that, he had then voluntarily extinguished himself. Had Ammon not chuckled, he would not have been Bob Ammon. The money was stolen, to be sure, but Ammon's skirts were clear. There was nothing to show that the $245,000 he had received was stolen money. There was only one man, a discredited felon, who could hint that the money was even tainted, and he was safely over the border, in a foreign jurisdiction, not in the custody of the police, but of Ammon himself, to be kept there, as Mr. Robert C. Taylor so aptly phrased it in arguing Ammon's case on appeal, on waiting orders. Ammon had Miller on a string, and as soon as Ammon, for his own sake, was compelled either to produce Miller or to run the risk of indictment, he pulled the string and brought Miller back into the jurisdiction. Needless to say, great was the ado made over the disappearance of the promoter of the Franklin Syndicate, and the authorities of Kings County speedily let it become known that justice required that someone should be punished for the colossal fraud which had been perpetrated. The grand jury of the county started a general investigation. Public indignation was stirred to the point of ebullition. In the midst of the rumpus, there came a knock on the office door of the Hon. John F. Clark, District Attorney of Kings County, and Col. Robert A. Ammon announced himself. The two men were entire strangers to each other, but this did not prevent Ammon, with his inimitable assurance, from addressing the district attorney by his first name. "How are you, John?" he inquired nonchalantly. "What can I do for you?" Mr. Clark repressed his natural inclination to kick the insolent fellow forcibly out of his office, invited him to be seated, and rang for a stenographer. Ammon asserted his anxiety to assist the district attorney by every means in his power, but denied knowing the whereabouts of Miller, alleging that he was simply acting as his counsel. Mr. Clark replied that in Miller's absence the grand jury might take the view that Ammon himself was the principal. At this, Ammon calmly assured his host that as far as he was concerned he was ready to go before the grand jury at any time. "That is just what I want," returned Mr. Clark, "the grand jury is in session. Come over." Ammon arose with a smile and accompanied the district attorney towards the door of the grand jury room. Just outside he suddenly placed his hand to his head, as if recollecting something. "One moment," he exclaimed. "I forgot that I have an engagement. I will come over tomorrow." "Ah," retorted Mr. Clark, "I do not think you will be here tomorrow." 2 weeks later Miller was safely ensconced without bail in Raymond Street Jail. Schlesinger, who got away with $175,000 in cash, fled to Europe where he lived high, frequenting the racetracks and gaming tables until he was called to his final account a year or two ago. The money which he took has never been traced. Miller was tried, convicted, and sent to Sing Sing. The appellate division of the Supreme Court then reversed his conviction, but later, on appeal to the Court of Appeals, it was sustained. Of the enormous sums turned over to Ammon, Miller received nothing save the money necessary for his support in Montreal, for the lawyers who defended him, and $5 per week for his wife and child up to the time he turned state's evidence. It is interesting to note that among the counsel representing Miller upon his trial was Ammon himself. Miller's wife and child were not sent to Montreal by Ammon, nor did the latter secure bail for his client at any time during his different periods of incarceration. The colonel knew very well that it was a choice between himself and Miller and took no steps which might necessitate the election falling upon himself. The conviction of Miller, with his sentence to 10 years in state's prison, did not, however, prevent the indictment of Ammon for receiving stolen money in New York County, although the chance that he would ever have to suffer for his crime seemed small indeed. The reader must bear in mind that up to the time of Ammon's trial Miller had never admitted his guilt, that he was still absolutely and apparently irrevocably under Ammon's sinister influence, keeping in constant communication with him and implicitly obeying his instructions while in prison, and that Miller's wife and child were dependent upon Ammon for their daily bread. No wonder Ammon strode the streets confident that his creature would never betray him. "Now, Billy, you don't want to be shooting off your mouth up here," was his parting injunction to his dupe on his final visit to Sing Sing before he became a guest there himself at the expense of the people. Miller followed his orders to the letter, and the stipend was increased to the munificent sum of $40 per month. Meantime the case against Ammon languished, and the district attorney of New York County was at his wits' end to devise a means to procure the evidence to convict him. To do this it would be necessary to establish affirmatively that the $30,500 received by Ammon from Miller and deposited with Wells, Fargo & Co. was the identical money stolen by Miller from the victims of the Franklin Syndicate. It was easy enough to prove that Miller stole hundreds of thousands of dollars, that Ammon received hundreds of thousands, but you had to prove that the same money stolen by Miller passed to the hands of Ammon. Only one man in the world, as Ammon had foreseen, could supply this last necessary link in the chain of evidence, and he was a convict and mute. It now became the task of the district attorney to induce Miller to confess the truth and take the stand against Ammon. He had been in prison a considerable time, and his health was such as to necessitate his being transferred to the hospital ward. Several of the district attorney's assistants visited him at various times at Sing Sing in the hope of being able to persuade him to turn state's evidence, but all their efforts were in vain. Miller refused absolutely to say anything that would tend to implicate Ammon. At last the district attorney himself, accompanied by Mr. Knott, who later prosecuted Ammon, made a special trip to Sing Sing to see what could be done. They found Miller lying upon his prison pallet, his harsh cough and blazing eyes, speaking only too patently of his condition. At first Mr. Knott tried to engage him in conversation while the district attorney occupied himself with other business in another part of the ward, but it was easily apparent that Miller would say nothing. The district attorney then approached the bed where Miller was lying, and inquired if it were true that he declined to say anything which might tend to incriminate Ammon. After some hesitation Miller replied that, even if he should testify against his old accomplice, there was nothing to show that he would be pardoned, and that he would not talk unless he had actually in his hands some paper or writing which would guarantee that if he did so he would be set free. The spectacle of a convicted felon haggling with an officer of the law over the terms upon which he would consent to avail himself of an opportunity to make the only reparation still possible angered the district attorney, and, turning fiercely upon the prisoner, he arraigned him in scathing terms, stating that he was a miserable swindler and thief, who had robbed thousands of poor people of all the money they had in the world, that he showed himself devoid of every spark of decency or repentance by refusing to assist the law in punishing his confederate and assisting his victims in getting back what was left of the money, and that he, the district attorney, felt himself humiliated in having consented to come there to visit and talk with such a heartless and depraved specimen of humanity. The district attorney then turned his back upon Miller, whose eyes filled with tears, but who made no response. A few moments later the convict asked permission to speak to the district attorney alone. With some reluctance the latter granted the request and the others drew away. "Mr. District Attorney," said the wretched man in a trembling voice, with the tears still suffusing his eyes, "I am a thief, I did rob all those poor people, and I am heartily sorry for it. I would gladly die, if by doing so I could pay them back. But I haven't a single cent of all the money that I stole, and the only thing that stands between my wife and baby and starvation is my keeping